Roderick. Ned breathed. Breath, lad. Roderick said as tears fell down his face. You're going to be all right. Ned laughed weakly. No, I'm not. Ned looked up at Roderick fearfully. Tell Ashura I love her. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her. Ned. Roderick asked, but Ned didn't respond. His breathing grew faint, and then the darkness enveloped him. Chapter 44, Eddard 12, The Last Dragon. Summary. Yes, as many of you correctly guessed, yesterday's chapter was an April Fool's joke. Hope you enjoyed. Here is the real chapter. I hope you enjoy it more than the last one. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. He got away. Ned didn't have to ask who. There could only be one person who Roderick would bother informing him had gotten away. Ned nodded. Do you know where he is? Roderick nodded. I've got a walk keeping an eye on him with an eagle, and one of my wolves has his scent. Let's get him. Roderick nodded, and together they made their way out of the copse of trees they had been hiding in and in the direction Roderick directed. One of his wolves padded along in front of them, its great snout pressed to the ground, following the invisible trail only it could detect. They had been following the wolf for at least an hour when Ned first noticed the signs of someone moving through here recently. A low-hanging branch had been snapped off, and in the mud of a puddle a horse's hoof prints could be clearly seen. Roderick closed his eyes for a second, before giving his attention back to Ned. He's just up ahead, in a clearing by a pool of water. He's injured. Ned nodded. I would have been surprised if he wasn't. Together the two of them made their way to the clearing where Roriger was. The second they entered the clearing, the horse that Roriger had fled on bolted away at the scent of the apex predator that padded along silently beside them. Roriger turned his head towards them, his body propped up on a rock next to a shallow pool of water. I'm afraid I have you at a disadvantage. Roriger said. What would your names be? Ned wordlessly reached up and removed his helm. He saw Roriger's eyes shift as he saw him. They went from quiet despair to an almost sort of hope. Lord Stark. Roriger greeted with a slight incline of his head. I'm sorry to not be seeing you in better circumstances. Me too. Ned responded with a sigh. I didn't kidnap her, you know. Ned averted his gaze. Who cares anymore? Roriger laughed weakly. You're right. No one cares anymore. It's become more than just a girl that couldn't bear to live with the life her father made for her. You blame us. A war is coming, Ned. It's Eddard. Roriger shook his head. It doesn't matter. A war is coming. The dragon needed 3 heads. I did what had to be done. I can die happy, knowing the world is safe. Ned shook his head. The war is already here, you fool. You're losing. No, Roriger responded. In the end it shall be you who loses. You will be hit first. Ned rolled his eyes. I don't have time for this, Roriger. Ned turned to Roderick. Take him. Roderick strolled forward and cracked Roriger across the head with his bronze gauntlet. It hit with a sickening crack, and Roriger dropped forward, knocked out cold. Ned dragged him over to his horse and threw him unceremoniously over the saddle. He grabbed his horse's reins and began to lead it away, back to the King's Road. Roderick walked beside him, both of them lost in thought. Ned lifted his head suddenly as the sound of beating hooves filled the air. He looked up to see his father bearing down on them, a look of murderous rage plastered over his face. Ned stopped his horse and threw Roriger's body to the ground. Rickard Stark pulled his horse in as he approached. I heard you were missing this. Ned said as he mounted his horse. It's all your foolish foster's brother's fault. The idiot rushed Roriger before the auxiliary hosts were in position. We managed to capture his army, but he still got away. He's always been like that. How was the rest of the battle? Quick. How was Tully? It went as expected. Good. Ned nodded, suddenly very tired. I'm going to go and find myself a nice bed to lie down in and have a rest. Call me when you have a need of me. Rickard nodded, and Ned kicked his horse's sides, leading it to his tent on the Trident, where hopefully he could find himself some rest and hot food. Chapter 45, Roriger I, Bloody Brandon the blessed bastard. Summary. Ricard and Roriger have a conversation. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. When Roriger awoke he was surprised to see that he was still alive and all in one piece. Indeed it looked as though someone had been sent to treat his wounds, as his broken ribs had been bandaged, and the cut on his head treated. He sat up and looked around the tent he was in. It was sparsely decorated and quite martial. It contained the cot on which he lay and a table with 2 chairs. Unfortunately there was no food or drink anywhere to be seen, and Roriger's parched throat ached considerably. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and struggled to his feet. He was dressed only in breeches, and grabbed the blanket from his bed to wrap around his bare chest. He winced as he made his way across the tent and to the flap of heavy wool that served as a door. He pushed it aside and stepped outside. He was greeted with the sight of a military encampment, thousands of tents large, amassed along the north of the Trident. In the far distance, he could see the bloody waters the river, and on the opposite bank piles of bodies. Immediately he was accosted by 2 soldiers clad in a strange bronze armor that Roriger had never seen before. They grasped him about the arms and frog-marched him back into the tent. "Wait here," one of them said. "Wait," Roriger rasped, "can I have some water?" The 2 men didn't listen however and marched straight back out. Sighing in resignation Roriger stumbled back to the bed and lay down. As he stared up at the roof, his thoughts wandered to the crushing defeat that he had just received, and the massive army that had broken him. Lionel was right it seemed, Roriger did know nothing. When the direwolf's fury was aroused it was a terrible thing to behold. Roriger had poked the beast when he ran away with Lionel, but his father had truly awoken it when he killed Brandon Stark and left Ricard Stark horribly burnt. Not only had Ricard Stark utterly outnumbered him, he had also utterly outmaneuvered him, trapping his host within the waters of the Trident. Roriger had been provoked and his troops had paid the ultimate price for his anger. He wondered where Sir Barristan was, if he even lived. For once, Roriger was glad that Sir Arthur wasn't by his side. He would have died also. Not even the Sword of the Morning would have been able to hold back the ocean of men that fell against them. He wondered what had happened to Randil Tali's troops. Either they had never come, which Roriger doubted, or even more foreboding, another host had managed to stop his march up the King's Road, an outcome that was even more terrible to behold. The sheer mass of men that Ricard Stark had managed to array against them was simply put, almost unbelievable. Indeed, Roriger would not have believed it himself if he hadn't seen the proof with his own 2 eyes. Torrhen Stark had faced his ancestor Aegon the Conqueror with 30,000 men. Ricard Stark had fielded at least 100,000 men against him at the Trident. He wondered how many men Ricard had left behind. His ancestors were fools. There was so much they did not know of the North. For so long they had been content believing the tales spun of a poor backwater region, filled with barbarian heathens. They should have known. The Starks controlled the largest region of Westeros. The Starks had the featly of the largest and most prestigious sellsword company in the world, the Company of the Rose. Roriger wondered if Torrhen had even brought his full strength to the Trident. To build an army like the one Ricard Stark had fielded, you first had to build a nation, a tremendous feat that many greater and richer rulers had failed at. Perhaps Torrhen had known of the power of dragons and instead was content to sit down, until the day when dragons would disappear from the world, a day in which the direwolf could rise up again, and throw the shackles of dragonfire off. The dragons had been dead for almost 150 years however, and the Starks had sat in silence. No, Roriger thought, there was something he was missing, some unknown factor that had stayed the Starks' hand for all these years. Curse his father, Roriger thought. Curse his father for bringing this monster down upon them. How long were the Starks content to kneel though? How long until they grew tired of kneeling at his family's knee? How long would have they stayed bowed for though? Roriger heard a rustling and a shaft of sunlight entered the gloomy interior of the tent. Roriger turned his head to the door to see Ricard Stark standing there, holding a tray of food and a jug of water. He was dressed in the heavy furs that the Northerners favored, but over his furs he had thrown a dark grey cloak with a large cowl. Strapped to his back was the Valyrian steel greatsword, Ice. At his side rested a knife, and Roriger suspected he saw the outline of another in his boot. Ricard stepped into the tent and placed the tray and jug on the table. He sat down in one of the chairs and gestured for Roriger to sit in the other. Roriger got up from the cot and sat down across from Lord Rickard. This was the first time that Roriger had seen Rickard Stark's scars up close, and they were even more grotesque than he had ever imagined. The skin had seemed to melt, before burning away, leaving a riddled, marred and melted mess. Roriger could not see a single hair anywhere on the man, and perhaps most horrifying was where the patch of skin had totally melted away, revealing the tender pink tendons of his cheekbone. Terrible to behold, aren't they? Rickard asked as he caught the direction of Roriger's gaze. Roriger started, alarmed at having been caught staring. Roriger swallowed, unable to tear his eyes away from the grim visage of the burnt lord. He replied. Rickard Stark snorted before gesturing to the food that he had brought with him. What would you like? Roriger shifted his gaze to the tray he had brought. There was some roast meat, a leafy salad, half of a cooked chicken and some fresh fruit. His eyes shifted to the jug and Rickard nodded, before picking the jug up and pouring him a cup of water. Roriger drank gratefully, appeasing the parched flesh of his throat. Thank you, Roriger said before picking up one of the peaches that were sitting on the tray. He bit into it and the fruit's juices dribbled down his chin. He scarfed it down as quickly as he could, sating the gnawing in his stomach before picking up some of the roast meat and eating it at a much more relaxed pace. The whole time Rickard Stark just sat there watching him, not saying a word. When he had eaten his fill, Roriger turned his attention back to Rickard. What have you kept me alive for? Rickard shrugged. Why do you think? Roriger thought deeply for a minute. You want to know where your daughter is? Rickard didn't respond, just sat there watching him. After a few seconds it became very awkward, so Roriger hurried to fill the silence. The first thing I want you to know is that I did not kidnap your daughter. We fell in love and I intend to make her my queen. Rickard's face muscles moved, and Roriger assumed he was attempting a frown. You wish to make her your queen? You're already married. Roriger nodded. That I am. However, the Targaryens' marriage rules have always been different to everyone else's. So you would seek to make her your second wife? Yes. And what of any children she has? They would sit in the line of succession as any other child of mine. You would potentially put Stark blood on the Iron Throne. Roriger nodded. If he could convince Rickard Stark to help him, maybe he could still overthrow his father. It was his only hope now, the last option left to him. It wouldn't have been his first option, but he would make do with what he had. Please gods, Roriger prayed, let him be convinced. I would. Our two houses were allies for centuries, and those were the best centuries the Seven Kingdoms have ever known, centuries of peace and prosperity, with a Targaryen sitting on the Iron Throne and a Stark serving as Warden of the North. They call me the last Dragon Lord Rickard. Honor the pledge your ancestors made, help me depose my father and I will pardon you all for rebelling. Rickard stayed silent, just observing Roriger, and Roriger decided to push on. When Torrhen bent the knee he had 30,000 men. You fielded at least 100,000 here today. Under Targaryen rule your lands and house have flourished. Imagine what we can accomplish together in another 300 years of Targaryen rule. Together we will lead these kingdoms to the greatest heights. Together we can be remembered as the two men that forged an empire greater than that of old Valyria. Rickard began to laugh then, and Roriger wondered if he had said something wrong. Rickard leant forward and rested his elbows on the table. Excuse my bluntness, Prince Roriger, but I don't give a fuck about Lyanna or whatever slum you've holed her up in. If I wanted to know her location I could find out by tomorrow. I didn't march south for her. I didn't swear to avenge her. I swore to avenge the son your mad father took from me. That is what I came south for, and that is why you're with me today instead of lying dead in the waters of the Trident. Please, Lord Stark, I know my father's madness better than any. Rickard laughed again. Even better than me. Roriger swallowed before averting his gaze. I didn't think so. Rickard spat. Roriger sighed. He had to try, he owed it to Lyanna. Please, Lord Stark, he beseeched, House Targaryen's rule has benefited your house greatly. Allow that to continue. Rickard frowned at him. Pray tell, how did House Targaryen's rule benefit House Stark? Roriger frowned. Am I wrong? Has the North not flourished in the last 300 years? Wrong you are, but not about that. What then am I wrong about? House Targaryen had nothing to do with the rise of the North. Well, no, that's not exactly true. Because of you, we were inspired to be greater, but you did nothing to actively build the North. What do you mean? Have you heard of bloody Brandon the Blessed Bastard? Do you mean Torrhen Stark's bastard brother? Yes. I know a little of him. Tell me what you know. He didn't want to bend to the Targaryens, so he fled east and founded the Company of the Rose, who grew into the most powerful sellsword group of all time. Is that all you know? Yes. Ricard snorted in amusement. You know nothing, Rhaegar Targaryen. Let me tell you the full story. Ricard stood up and began to pace. When Aegon first landed in Westeros and began his conquest of the Seven Kingdoms, Brandon Snow, unlike everyone else, believed him to be a threat. So he began to research how to kill dragons. No one knows if his research was right, but he believed he had found a way to kill dragons. So Torrhen Stark marched south to take on Aegon's army. As you would well know by now, their Torrhen was greeted with 3 dragons and 45,000 men, more than he had brought with him. Torrhen made a decision then, because he knew that even if his brother succeeded in killing the dragons, he would still have to stave off the larger Targaryen army, something he knew he would be unable to do. So he placed his people before his pride and bent the knee, earning the wrath of his bastard brother and all his sons. Brandon, wroth with his brother, helped forge the peace process and then left. Where to, no one knew. Many believed he had gone to gather the lords who did not want to bend the knee, but the moons passed and no one had heard nor seen of any trace of him. Torrhen mourned at the brother he had lost, and his sons mourned the uncle that had gone. Torrhen pushed on though, beginning his new role as Warden of the North. More than 3 moons had passed since Torrhen had bent the knee, and Torrhen was holding court in Winterfell. On this particular day he was trying a man that had been accused of rape. In the middle of the proceedings the doors slammed open and in strode a strange man no one had seen before. His hair was as white as the snow which fell from the sky, and the pupils of his eyes were as red as the sap that dripped from the faces of the weirwoods. Without a word he strode into the hall, grabbed the man by arm and began to drag him out of the hall. Those present were so surprised at the boldness of his actions, it took them a while to respond. He managed to make it to the door before being confronted. Ignoring the protests of the guards that went to stop him, he made his way to the Godswood of Winterfell. The court had followed him, their curiosity aroused by the strange albino that had interrupted proceedings so. With Torrhen that day were many of the great lords of the north, including the Boltons, Umbers, Karstarks, Marndalis, Mormonts, Glovers, Dustins, Ryswells, Sawins, Tallhearts, Hornwoods and the Reeds of the Neck. In the north to this day these houses are regarded as the founding families because of what they witnesses that day. So this strange albino man had taken the rapist from the hall and dragged him before the Heart Tree of Winterfell. The court assembled to see what he was going to do, and when the man spoke Torrhen finally recognized him. His bastard brother had returned home. He gave a short speech of why the North had lost its crown. It was good, but it wasn't memorable, indeed the words he spoke have been lost to time. It was what he did next that became the stuff of legends within the North. He pulled out a dragonglass dagger and plunged it deep into the man's belly and cut a jagged hole. Then he reached in with his bare hands and pulled out the man's innards before throwing them into the boughs of the tree. Then he slit the struggling man's throat, and left his corpse lying in front of the tree. The court, which till now had remained silent in horror, surged forward determined to stop this madman. Ricard laughed then, before turning back to Rhaegar with a mad glint in his eye. What happened next is sacred knowledge only known to the direct ancestors of those who were present, but at the end it was agreed that the old gods had reawakened. Weirwoods began to grow in the south again, the green men ended their self-imposed exile upon the Isle of Faces. The lords of the north stopped sending their criminals to the wall and instead begun to give them to the gods, and the weirwoods continued to be fed by the blood of the unworthy. And thus the power of the old gods grew, and with the growing power of the old gods so too did the power of the north. The gods had gifted Brandon Snow with knowledge, you see, and Brandon used this knowledge to begin the forging of a nation that the world would tremble before. And thus we grew, our power continuing to expand, our wealth continuing to grow and our strength continuing to multiply till this day. Ricard paced the length of the tent once more before returning to his seat. You see, Rhaegar, he snarled, You Targaryens had nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with our strength. All we have built upon our own backs with the blessings of our gods, the old gods, the gods that were here before us and shall be here after us. Rhaegar nodded slowly. I see, he said carefully. So what do you want with me? Ricard smirked before getting to his feet. He turned to leave before stopping at the door. Bloody Brandon the Blessed used the blood of a common criminal to awake our gods from a slumber of over 1,000 years. He turned his head then, and looked back at Rhaegar with a strange hunger in his eyes. Imagine what our gods will be able to do with the blood of old Valyria feeding their roots. On that grim note Ricard Stark left the tent, leaving Rhaegar to stew on all he had just heard. Chapter 46, Tywine 2, I've heard your howl. Summary. Tywine receives some news. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. Tywine Lannister watched from doorway of his tent as his army drilled on the fields in front of him. The sight filled him with pride. He had built this army from almost nothing. His weakling of a father had led his house to the verge of ruin, but Tywine had built it back up. Where his house was once laughed about in taverns, it was now whispered of in fear. And who are you, the proud lord said, that I must bow so low? Who was Aerys, Tywine thought, to demand that he bow so low? He had insulted his house, he had threatened the legacy of House Lannister, and most unforgivably he had stolen his heir. Well, a reckoning was coming. Aerys had demanded his troops, and his troops he would receive. He watched as a rider appeared on the horizon, his horse thundering through the fields of marching men. Perhaps this man brought news of the Trident. Perhaps he would tell him how he would kill Aerys. Would he die at the hand of a disgruntled rebel or by the hands of a Lannister himself? The messenger reined his horse in as he approached Tywine's pavilion and stopped a few feet away. Kevan Lannister, his ever-dutiful brother, moved to intercept the messenger. Tywine turned away and returned into his tent. If it was of importance, Kevan would let him know. He was in the middle of pouring himself a cup of wine when Kevan finally entered. Well? Tywine asked. Kevan just handed him a scroll. Tywine took a sip of his wine before putting the cup down and grabbing the scroll from Kevan's grasp. He rolled it open and read the words written on the inside. Rhaegar Targaryen's host was utterly defeated. Ricard Stark managed to trap the entire host in the waters of the Trident. Tarlis' host has disappeared, assumed destroyed. Rhaegar Targaryen's fate is unknown. He escaped the battlefield but was believed to have been caught by Ricard Stark. The way to King's Landing is clear. The corners of Tywine Lannister's mouth twitched. Perhaps he had underestimated the Burnt Lord. It seemed Aerys would get to die at the hands of a Lannister after all. What do we do about Rhaegar? Kevan asked. What of him? It says his fate is unknown. His army is broken. If he somehow managed to escape Ricard Stark, he is friendless and most likely alone. If he didn't, then he's as good as dead. Ricard Stark will not forget the loss of his son or the kidnapping of his daughter. If his death is anything but slow and painful, I would be most surprised. Kevan nodded before taking a sip of his own wine. How do you think he did it? Who did what? Ricard Stark. Kevan clarified. How do you think he managed to trap and defeat their entire army? Tywine shrugged. I'm sure we will learn in time. What I want to know is what happened to Tarlis' host. It's not just any man that can defeat Randil Tarly in battle. He was said to have a host 20,000 men strong. Kevan nodded. It's almost uncanny. A host of 20,000 men doesn't just go missing. Regardless, this means that we can move on. Aerys' time is up. It is time he gets the Lannister troops he demanded. Kevan nodded. I'll go and ready the troops. Tywine nodded. Send me Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorque when you see them. I have a very special assignment for them. Kevan nodded and left. He was waiting for almost half an hour before the two of them finally made their way into his presence. They arrived almost at the same time, and when Amory held the flap of cloth open that served as a door, a small swallow flew in with him. It settled in the rafters of the tent, twittering and flying around before finally finding a resting place it liked and calming down. Returning his gaze to his two soldiers, Tywine gestured for them to sit. We have received news from the north. Tywine began. It seems Rickard Stark and his barbarians managed to trap and defeat Rhaegar's host. At the same time, Randil Tarlis' host has gone missing, presumed destroyed. The way to King's Landing is clear. Sir Gregor grunted in acknowledgement before picking up the jug of wine and downing most of it in one gulp. Tywine eyed him in distaste before continuing. When we get to King's Landing I have a special assignment for the both of you, one that requires you to be discreet. Amory Lorque nodded. What do you need done? When all this is done and dusted I want Lannister blood sitting on the Iron Throne. Currently there are a few people standing in the way of this. You want us to kill the Dornish wench and her kids? Amory asked. Yes. Tywine said. They will be a threat to Robert's rule. It will ensure that there will be no challenges to Robert's rule and prove to Robert that we are loyal and trustworthy servants. Amory nodded. Consider it done. Good. Tywine said as he shifted his gaze to Sir Gregor. And you? Do you have any objections? None at all. Sir Gregor replied. I want this done discreetly. I don't want their ghosts coming back to haunt me. Am I clear? Amory and Gregor nodded and Tywine dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Tywine rose from his seat and followed them out of his tent. In the distance he could see his army packing up, preparing to move out. Soon Lannister blood would be seated upon the Iron Throne. Soon Aerys would fall, and then Tywine's vengeance would be upon him. Robert Baratheon would be king, Cersei Lannister would be queen and the Targaryen dynasty would fall at the hands of a Lannister. It would be glorious and remind all why Tywine Lannister was a man to be feared. He had taken down his father, he had destroyed the reigns of Castamere and soon the reigns of Castamere would be forgotten, to be replaced with the Targaryens of Dragonstone. Thank the gods for fools like Rickard Stark, Tywine thought, thank the gods for fools who pushed this country to war. Chapter 47, Ashura v. The Falling Stars. Summary. Ashura and Arthur had a think. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Notes. I understand that everyone has their view and wants to share it, but please be respectful of other people's opinions. We don't always have to agree, as a matter of fact it is our differences that make us interesting, but we need to have a basic level of respect for other people's opinions. Thanks for your guys' continued support and feedback. Really appreciate it, it is what drives me to finish this, so keep them coming. Chapter text. Rhaegar had been defeated. His army had been scattered amongst the waters of the Trident, his support frozen by the harsh northern winds, and if the rumors were to be believed his life was forfeit. What had happened to Rhaegar no one seemed to know. The ravens they had received all contradicted the sayings of the others. One said that he had fallen to Robert Baratheon's warhammer, another said he had escaped and retreated to King's Landing, while others suggested that he was Rickard Stark's captive. The most amusing one she had read so far was the one that suggested her Ned had captured him himself. Ned was a fine warrior, but Rhaegar had been trained alongside the Sword of the Morning. Then again, she remembered what Ned had told her and Jon Arryn. If the North could field 140,000 men, maybe it didn't matter, and Ned had merely been the one to deliver the blow that broke Rhaegar, the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Her brother had arrived a few days after she had received the first raven, seeking supplies for himself and his companions. Arthur had been absolutely broken when he read the raven. He had retreated to his room and wept like a child for ages. When he finally emerged he had taken the supplies and left without even saying goodbye. She was glad he was hurting. He deserved to lose those he cared about like she had lost her Ned. He deserved to lose his Silver Prince like she had lost her Quiet Wolf. She still mourned for what she had lost. Her child was growing within her, the last piece of him she had left apart from the bracelet of drywood that encircled her wrist. It had been 6 moons since she had last seen him, and 6 moons since he had lain with her. Her loins burned as she thought of the nights they spent together, entangled in each other's arms. She doubted that Catelyn Tully would ever be able to give him what Ashura had. At least Ned had loved her, and come to her bed willingly. She hadn't even had to ask him in the end, a fact that amused her to no end. When she had stopped pursuing him was when he finally gave her what she wanted most. In her belly her child kicked and Ashura smiled down at the growing bump. She hoped that her child would have Ned's eyes, not hers. She hoped her child would have eyes of steel that would melt away to a foggy grey when stirred to love, like Ned's did whenever he looked at her. Ned would never look at Caitlin Tully like that. Gods, where did everything go wrong? What had happened? The pain inside was unbearable sometimes. Not from her belly, no, from her heart. Ashura wondered if anyone had ever died of a broken heart. That's what she felt like sometimes, and it drained the will to live right out of her. What was life without love? What was life without Ned? Gods. Arthur 3. Roriger was defeated. They were the three simple words that had torn his world apart. Ashura had been the first to tell him, and he wasn't sure what had hurt him more. Whether it was the fact that Roriger was most probably dead, or the triumphant glint in Ashura's eyes when she told him so. Gods, Arthur had been a fool. Roriger had doomed the realm to war, and Arthur had sat back and watched as he had done so. The glint in Ashura's eyes though had hurt the most. He knew she had loved Eddard Stark. He knew she wanted to marry him. He knew, gods, he had been there when they had knelt together before a heart tree, and in her eyes he had destroyed her dreams with his own hands. He had been so dumb. What happened? Sigurd asked him. Arthur glanced at him. Roriger was defeated. Arthur repeated, still not sure if he believed it himself. Really? Sir Oswell asked sarcastically, how was Roriger defeated? They say Rickard Stark managed to trap his entire army in the waters of the Trident. The entire host? Sigurd exclaimed, where did they get the men? I don't know. Arthur exclaimed. Maybe they recalled the Company of the Rose. Sir Oswell suggested. They didn't. Apparently the company is still in Braavos. They should have only been able to field 40,000 men. How many men does the North have? I don't know. Sir Oswell shifted. You know who would know. Arthur glanced at his old friend. Who? Oswell glanced to the tower behind them. She would. You're right. Sigurd said. Let's go and ask her now. Together the three men got to the feet and wandered into the tower, up the stairs and into her room. She was sitting by a window, staring out across the desert, while the midwife that Arthur had brought from Starfall was seated across from her, working on some embroidery. She glanced at them as they entered and smirked. What have I done to deserve the company of all three of you at the same time? We want answers. Lyanna's smirk disappeared and was replaced by a look of such grief that Arthur could not help but feel a little sorry for the poor girl. I take it then that Roriger has fallen? Yes. Sigurd replied. You fools. Lyanna said, I warned you, I told you, I was the only one capable of stopping this conflict, and instead you kept me here. What do you want to know? How many men can your father field? Lyanna frowned. I'll answer that when you tell me the truth of everything that happened. Arthur glanced at the Lord Commander, who nodded at him. Roriger left King's Landing with 55,000 troops. He called for 20,000 more troops from Storm's End. The first host was tracked and destroyed at the Trident, the second went missing. Lyanna turned away and returned her gaze to the desert. You're all doomed. Excuse me? Arthur asked. Run away. Flee. Get out of here. We are Kingsguard. Sigurd said, we do not flee. Fools. She hissed. You'll die then. I think whoever comes will find us more than able to put up a fight. Lyanna laughed bitterly. There is no standing against the hellfire my father will bring. Do you think the host that went missing just got lost and will show up in a few weeks? No, she snarled, no. They're dead, all of them. How can you know? Sir Oswell asked. How can I know? All in the north know of the Mount Starpoint. No one knows what it housed, but if an entire host went missing, I would say that my father opened its gates. If the gates of Mount Starpoint are open, the Targaryens are doomed. How do you know? Dead men tell no tales. Lyanna said. The last thing my father wants is anyone learning of his secret weapon. What is it? What is his secret weapon? Lyanna looked at him with eyebrows raised. You expect me to tell you? Yes. Sigurd replied. I don't know. She replied. Bullshit. Sir Oswell said. I'm not lying. The only people who know what lies behind those gates is the Lord of Winterfell and the heir. It is otherwise forbidden knowledge. Arthur rolled his eyes. Trying to get answers out of her was like trying to get a mule to drink. How many men can your father field? He asked again. Or do you not know that either? She glanced at him. No, I know. The real question is whether you are sure you want to know. Yes. Sir Gerald insisted. 140,000 men. Lyanna replied, and Arthur felt his heart stop. Chapter 48, Eddard 13, The Race to King's Landing. Summary. There is a race. Who will win? Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. The Northern cavalry marched out of the camp on the Trident in 3 long lines, some 40,000 riders. Eddard Stark sat upon the other side of the Trident and watched as the lines crossed the river and formed into marching columns on the other side. His father had already sent the Weirwood warriors ahead under the command of their Lord Commander, Roderick Walton. They had taken the underground and left almost a few days earlier with orders to secure the gates and other strategic points within the city. His father sat beside him now, his grim spectre haunting the otherwise pleasant surroundings. The signs of the battle that had raged here almost 3 weeks ago now was almost gone. The blooded waters had been washed away, the bodies of the fallen burnt, and the first shoots of grass had begun to shoot up in the ground that had been torn apart by marching feet and pounding hooves. Ned looked over his shoulder where Rhaegar sat, perched upon his own horse. His hands were bound and he was closely shadowed by Great Jon Umber, Jaime Darkstark, Torrhen Stark and Brandon Stark. The Starks and Starks seemed to be a house of eternal jokers. The two houses were founded by a pair of brothers, who were the second and third sons of the then Lord of Winterfell. As a joke, they had named their houses after their position in the line of succession. Their sons carried on the tradition of being the japing fools of the North, and Ned had to admit they were sometimes very funny people. Both Torrhen and Brandon were renowned for their practical jokes, and at the tourney of Harrenhal had managed to trick one drunken Reach Lord into having sex with a pig. The two of them had had to flee the tourney after that, as the Reach Lord had gathered some men and was hunting them down. Regardless of their penchant for practical jokes, they were both fine warriors, and took their duties as scions of House Stark most seriously. The other man guarding Prince Rhaegar, Jaime Darkstark, was the exact opposite of Torrhen and Brandon. Serious and dour, he had become the Prince of Brooding since losing his brother in King's Landing. His brother, Eldrick Darkstark, was the finest horseman Ned had ever seen, and would have won the tourney of Harrenhal had Aerys not interfered. Eldrick had left an infant son behind, but Jaime Darkstark had refused to stay in the north and secure his nephew's rule, instead riding south as fast as possible to get vengeance for his dead brother. He was nowhere near as good as his dead brother, but then again no one was, and Ned doubted anyone would ever be again. Regardless, he was still a good fighter, with a fine sense of duty. The last of his cavalry force had crossed the river and formed into a marching column. Beside him his father nodded, clearly proud at the discipline instilled in the North's cavalry. He nodded to the hornblower at his side, who blew a note to start the march. The host cantered forward, and Ned tapped the sides of his horse. It trotted forward, Ned taking his place at the head of the column beside his father. "Will we beat Tywin Lannister?" Ned asked his father as they made their way down the King's Road. "It'll be tight," his father managed to reply. Tywin Lannister was marching down the Gold Road as they spoke, intent on capturing the city and presenting it to Robert as a show of fealty. Ned wouldn't have been bothered and let him take the city, but the northern spies had reported that he planned to sack the city, and kill the remaining Targaryens. Ned had made a promise to Ashura though, and he would fulfill it as best as he could. He looked down at the Weirwood bracelet encircling his wrist, and his midfield filled with thoughts of the woman he loved. "I won't let him have the city," his father muttered. "He won't have the honor that rightfully belongs to us." Ned wondered if his father was more concerned for the citizens of the city or missing out on his opportunity to have his revenge on Aerys. Ned suspected it was the latter, but he didn't like what Tywin was doing either. He had sat out the entire war, and now that it was all but done was marching to take a city guarded by green boys and old men. It was a low act, and insulting to all the men that had fought and bled and died at the Trident while Tywin sat safe within the Westerlands. They made good time the first few days, and the weather seemed to be aiding them. A strong northern breeze was blowing from behind them, bringing cold gusts of air that made Ned long for the halls of Winterfell, where the snow fell and the wind was a constant companion and friend. He often spent the days in the wind wondering of how Benjen was doing. His little brother had been left behind, all alone to run the Giant of the North alone. Ned missed the days when they were all at home, when Brandon was still alive, when his father still smiled with joy, when Lyanna hadn't gone missing. He smiled fondly at the memories before frowning at the realization that it could never be. Brandon was gone, his father was scarred, but Ned would get Lyanna back if it was the last thing he ever did. The night before they reached the city, Ricard called all the commanders into a meeting. Ned was the last to arrive, having ridden with the very rear of the column for the day. He entered to find most of the lords of the north gathered. His father nodded at his entrance and gestured for him to take his spot by his right side. Ned went and stood at his shoulder and looked out upon the group of lords. "We will beat Tywine," his father began. His declaration was met with cheers of relief and happiness. Few of the men here knew what had been on the line, but it still did not sit well with them that another lord was coming to steal the glory of capturing the city for themselves. Even so, it was a relief for Ned to hear as well, knowing what was on the line. Then his father had to ruin it. "It will be close though, we will have barely 15 minutes to enact our revenge, take the gates and enter the city. Then it's a simple race to the Red Keep." Ned's heart sunk. That was an incredibly close margin, and although his father's spy swore that Tywine planned on taking the city, Ned could not rule out Tywine having a last-minute change of heart and attacking them instead. The last thing they wanted was to get trapped between the walls of the city and a hostile force. Everyone knew that was as good as death. That is not all though. His father continued. There are threats and dangers that can destroy us all if we are not careful. Like what? Someone down the back called. Aerys has been stockpiling wildfire. He plans to blow the city up upon our entrance. I've set some of our assets within the city to securing the caches, but we need to capture the caches for ourselves before we delve deeper into the city. If even one of the caches goes off, we all die. Gods, someone murmured, and Ned could not help but agree. Aerys was truly sick to condemn to death an entire city of innocent people. Not for the first time Ned felt a hatred for the Kingsguard stir within him. It was those knights in shining armor that had stood by as Aerys had torn the realm apart with his madness. It was those knights with white cloaks that had stood by as Aerys had torn his family apart with his madness. Ned did not consider himself to be a vengeful person, but even he could not help the stirrings of anger that filled him when he thought of the Kingsguard. There are wildfire caches located under the Great September of Baelor, the Dragon Pit, the Red Keep, under every gate, and even the Red Keep itself. Lord Darkstark, you will secure the caches under each of the gates. Lord Riverstark, you shall secure the cache under the September. Lord Riswell, you shall secure the caches under the Dragon Pit. Rumor has it that there is another cache somewhere in Flea Bottom. Lord Karstark, that cache shall be your responsibility. Lord Umber, you shall take the guild hall of the sick fucks that make this stuff. Secure all of the members and any supplies of the substance they may have. Try to keep at least one of them alive. Each of the lords nodded as they were given their tasks, before rushing away to prepare their men. Lord Bolton. His father called and Roose stepped forward. Your job is to stop the Lannister host from entering the city if capable, but if not, at least limiting the damage they can do. Their army will be coming down the Gold Road and most probably enter via the Golden Gate. Lord Bolton nodded before turning and rushing away. The rest of you are responsible for putting down the defenders of the city. All the lords nodded before leaving the tent and going on their way. What shall I be doing, father? Ned asked. His father turned to him. You and me shall join the Weirwood warriors and take the Red Keep. When this is all done, Aerys shall die at my hand. Ned nodded. What of Elia Martell and her children? Ned asked with a hint of trepidation. His father just smirked at him. Yours to do with as you please. Ned nodded, relieved. I'll have you know though, that Tywine has ordered 2 of his dogs to kill her and her kids. Who? Ned asked fearfully. Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorque. Ned swallowed. Gregor Clegane had not earned the moniker of the mountain who rides for nothing. It would be tough. Go get some rest. His father said as he turned away. You'll have a big day tomorrow. Ned nodded and left, seeking the solace of his own tent. He lay awake in the darkness till late that night, stewing on all the things that could go wrong tomorrow. If he was lucky though, by the time the sun set tomorrow, Eris would be dead and Elia Martell and her children would be far far away. Chapter 49, The Battle for King's Landing. Summary. Well. Do not ask how I managed to do this one. Somehow I wrote 10,000 words today. I don't even understand how I did this. Originally this was meant to be broken up over several chapters, but I would finish one part and then not be happy with how it finished, so I would continue writing. Please, I put a ton of effort into this, so leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. Record 6. The sun rose on the horizon and the burnt lord was awake to greet it. His host was riding down the King's Road, towards the walls of King's Landing that were illuminated by the rising sun. By the time the sun set, the Targaryen dynasty would have all but fallen. King's Landing would be in the hands of the Starks, to hold until Robert Baratheon arrived to ascend to his kingship. Rickard Stark doubted Robert Baratheon's ability to run a kingdom, but to be fair, Rickard really didn't care. If Robert was an incompetent king, it would only make it easier for the North to break away when they did. He couldn't believe he had ever thought of betrothing his daughter to the fool. The man had almost ruined months of careful planning by his reckless and ill-timed charge at Rhaegar during the Battle of the Trident. Thankfully Ned had been able to cover for Robert's mistakes, but Rickard had no intention of allowing that pattern to continue. A change was coming to Westeros, and Rickard was front and center. He was going to ensure that the Starks came out of this war on top. He would make sure to grab as many opportunities as he could while here. As a boy, his favorite stories had involved Theon the Hungry Wolf Stark. The Hungry Wolf was a hard and brutal man that had beaten back invasions by the Ironborn and Andals, before taking his armies south and sacking it for all it was worth. Not done yet, he had then traveled to Andalos, the homelands of the Andals, and sacked it too. He was the embodiment of everything Rickard hoped to be to the Targaryen dynasty. Brutal, harsh and utterly unforgiving, Theon had warned the world of the wrath of Kingdom of Winter. When Rickard was dead, he wanted people to remember him as the man that had broken the Targaryens, much as people remembered Theon for breaking the Andals. Rickard wanted to drag down the last gasps of a dead empire that should have died when the 14 flames exploded during the Doom. He wanted to tear the Targaryens asunder, and behind him lay the key to doing so. Rhaegar Targaryen had been dressed in his full plate armor, which had been repaired especially for this occasion. The black armor drank in the shadows while its encrusted rubies glittered in the light of the rising sun. He was still bound and followed by the 4 men who had become his full-time carers. His guards were all dressed for war, in full plate armor with heavy fur coats to protect them from the bitter bite of the northern wind that had constantly been blowing over the last few days. Rickard switched his gaze to the black knife that hung from his belt. It had been given to him by the Cranogman who was to oversee the ceremony, along with the instructions for what he had to do. He breathed deeply and turned his gaze back to the city of King's Landing. Soon his debts to Aerys Targaryen would be repaid, and the Targaryen dynasty that had taken so much from him would be laid low. He switched his gaze to the southwest, where he could see the column of dust that marked the position of Tywin Lannister's forces. They were almost here. It was time to begin. Tywin 3. His host was marching in disciplined columns down the Gold Road and towards the Golden Gate. It was to be a simple conquest, a city that was waiting for a host of northern barbarians to attack the city. Tywin would be received as a savior, the gates thrown open in relief. It would be then, once his troops were within the walls, that he would blow his horns and the sack of the city that the Targaryens had ruled since they first landed in Westeros would begin. Aerys and the Targaryen blood he was so proud of would be brought low, and Tywin would have his heir back. He would sack the city for the simple fact that it was Targaryen. Aerys had thought himself above them all because his ancestor had ridden a dragon and come from Valyria, the greatest empire to have ever existed. Unfortunately, no one had seemed to inform Aerys that the dragons that had made his family so feared were dead, and the empire his ancestors had come from was a smattering of ruined islands in the middle of the smoking sea. So Aerys had continued to act with the impunity of a man who held all the power, when in reality he held none. It was a dangerous position to be in, and now he would get his dues for acting the way he had. The power Aerys had thought he had was nothing more than an illusion, kept there for the sake of peace. Today Tywine would rip the illusion away and tear Aerys from the Iron Throne. Today Tywine would finish the Targaryen line. Tomorrow would be the day for putting Cersei beside Robert on the Iron Throne. As the sun rose, Tywine noticed a column of dust to the northeast, a telltale sign of a marching host. Last Tywine had heard, though, the rebels were still camped upon the banks of the Trident. Perhaps this was where Randil Tarlis' missing host was. Tywine gestured for one of his outriders to come close. The man rode his horse over and Tywine gestured to the column of dust in the distance. "Go and find out what is the cause of that." The man nodded and spurred his horse away, racing across the fields to find out the cause of the disturbance. The next few minutes were spent in tense silence, wondering who else had enough men to muster a force near King's Landing. Tywine hoped it was Tarly rather than a rebel force. A rebel force could spell disaster for his carefully laid plans. While Tarly could be a thorn in his side, he doubted he had the man to stop him, particularly once he was within the city walls. He turned in his saddle and called for Sir Gregor and Amory Lorque. Regardless of who it was, he wanted to be prepared and ensure that the Targaryens would fall at the hands of Lannister men. The two men he called for came forward to meet him at the head of the column. "What's going on over there?" Sir Amory asked as he nodded to the column of dust. "I'm not sure," Tywine replied. "I've sent a man to investigate as we speak. Regardless, the second we enter the city, take your men and be on your way. Do not stop for anything, get to your target and complete your mission as soon as possible." The two men nodded, both understanding the added risk of their mission and the need for speed. They spurred their horses away to ready their men, while Tywine returned his gaze to the cloud of dust on the horizon. A few minutes later his outrider reappeared, racing across the fields to his northeast with haste. The man pulled up in front of Tywine, his horse panting heavily, suggesting it had been driven hard to get here. "Who is it?" Tywine asked. "It's the Starks, my lord." "The Starks?" Tywine exclaimed. "Did you see any of the Starks themselves?" "I saw both Rickard and Eddard Stark." "Both of them?" "Yes." This was not good. Rickard Stark did not strike Tywine as the sort of man to just sit back and allow others to fight his fights for him. This was the man that Aerys had tried to burn alive, the man that had lost his son's life because of Aerys' madness. He had to beat him to the city. "How far away are they from the city?" Tywine asked. "They're already there, my lord. They're forming their troops into battle formations." "Gods," Tywine thought, "they've already beaten us. How many men did they have?" "At a guess, maybe 40,000 cavalry." 40,000 cavalry. Tywine exclaimed. "Where did they get all the horses?" "I don't know, my lord." "But that's not all. What else is there?" "They have Rhaegar Targaryen." Tywine felt his heart begin to pound in his chest. This was insane. The Starks had Rhaegar Targaryen with them. What was Rhaegar Targaryen doing? He was on a horse in plate armor. It made no sense. Rickard Stark had lost a son and daughter because of Rhaegar Targaryen's actions. It was not feasible for him to suddenly change sides in the war and support Rhaegar Targaryen over Robert Baratheon. Unless, Rhaegar had promised to make Lyanna his queen in exchange for Rickard's support. It still made no sense though. "Did you notice anything else about him?" Tywine asked the outrider. "He was surrounded by a lot of men. I'm not sure whether they were to protect him, or ensure he didn't run away. It looked like his hands were bound, but I'm not sure." Suddenly it all made sense. Rickard Stark had managed to capture Rhaegar Targaryen alive and planned to make a spectacle of his death for the citizens of King's Landing. How he planned to do this Tywine had no idea, and to be frank he didn't care. If he wanted to make a show of Rhaegar's death, let him. He would not however take the city that Tywine hungered after. He turned to the herald that rode at his side. "Double time the march. We must beat the Starks there." The watcher on the wall. The men gathered before the old gate, just outside the range of the arrows of the city's defenders. They were a strange lot, composed of the lords of the north. Their number ranged from the small men of the Crannogs of the Neck to the giant lords that lived in the shadow of the wall. Clad in thick furs and plain grey plate, they did not seem to fit in with the image of lords that the citizens of King's Landing were accustomed to seeing. They looked out of place, and would have no doubt looked more at home surrounded by falling snow and the weeping weirwoods of the north. With them though was Rhaegar Targaryen, and there was no mistaking his identity. He had been dressed in his armored black plate that was encrusted with rubies, his helm left off so all could behold his silver hair and purple eyes. Next to him was a man that hadn't been seen in the city since the day the king attempted to burn him alive, and the scars from that day still showed as fresh as ever. He was a truly terrible sight to behold. The small Crannog men has formed a circle around Prince Rhaegar, who was being held up by one of the giant lords. They began to chant in a strange, guttural tongue that clashed on the ears of those standing on the walls. The burnt lord strode into the midst of men and stood beside Rhaegar. He turned to the city walls and raised a strange black knife that glittered in the sunlight high in the air. "Aerys!" he cried, "a son for a son." With that he brought the knife down into Rhaegar's chest and it smashed through his black plate armor and into his chest. Scarlet blood ran out of the hole in his armor and began to pour onto the ground. Rhaegar's face contorted in agony and his scream of pain split the air. The Crannog men's chanting grew louder, and the sound of drumming began to join the crescendo. The burnt lord stepped back from Prince Rhaegar's body and pulled something out of the pouch that hung around his neck. He held it high in the air for a second before throwing it into the rapidly growing puddle of Rhaegar's blood. The Crannog men's chanting was reverberating through the very air and the drums continued to pound away while Rhaegar's screams of agony still hung heavily in the air. Then as suddenly as it had begun the drums stopped and Rhaegar's screams fell away. The chanting continued, but now it was little more than a whisper rather than the crescendo it had been. As the watchers on the wall watched, movement stirred from within the puddle of Rhaegar's blood. From the scarlet blood came strange white strands that wrapped themselves around Prince Rhaegar's torso. The giant lord holding Prince Rhaegar sprung away, almost fearfully. The chanting continued and the white strands continued to wrap themselves around Prince Rhaegar. The strands began to take shape around the prince, and the watchers realized a weirwood tree was growing around the prince. From the white strands sprang small red buds that grew to reveal themselves as the blood-colored leaves of the weirwood. The tree continued to grow, encasing the prince deeper and deeper within a web of its branches. It was stretching high, almost the size of an adult tree, at least 4 meters in height, and with a width to rival the oldest oaks in the Kingswood. The only part of Rhaegar's body that was still visible was his face, the rest having been swallowed by the rapidly growing tree. The tree was leaching more blood, though there was so much that the watchers doubted it all came from Rhaegar. It dripped from the leaves, flowed from every crevice and poured from the nose on Rhaegar's exposed face. It formed a puddle, nay a pool, around the base of the tree, red and thick, and with the breeze that blew the air was filled with the coppery scent of blood. The chanting continued and the tree continued to grow. One watcher tore his gaze away from the spectacle and shifted his gaze to those of the watching northern lords. They looked just as horrified and transfixed as the watchers on the wall. Did they even know what their liege lord had planned? Did they understand what they had just done? They had killed the last dragon, the last hope for House Targaryen. One though did not look horrified, instead looking on with what the watcher supposed was grim satisfaction. It was hard to tell with the horrifying burns that covered his entire body though. The burnt lord truly was as horrifying as the stories had sold him. If anything, the stories did not capture the true essence of the man in its entirety. The burnt lord looked like death, and the watcher did not doubt he would take the heads of any who stood in his way. The burnt lord had defied death, refusing to kneel before the mighty grip of Aerys Wildfire, a grip of death that had claimed many men before him. They said the burnt lord's eldest son had defied the grip of the chains and ropes that bound him, defied the grip of those who wished him dead. The watcher wondered what the other Starks were capable of, and decided if the two that had entered King's Landing were anything to go by, he had no intention of meeting another. In the field outside the city, the tree had stopped dripping blood and was in the final throes of its growth spurt. It stopped shooting upwards, standing at 6 meters tall, but it hadn't finished its grim spectacle yet. Rhaegar's face, twisted in a scream of agony, was still exposed to the world. As the watchers watched, more white strands grew over his face, covering his fine features and Targaryen beauty. The tree stopped moving altogether then, and the chanting of the Crannog men stopped. The very air and earth reverberated around them, and the watchers felt the wall shake. In front of them, in the field in front of the gate, they gazed upon the weirwood tree that the lords of the north had sung into existence. They beheld the white bark and blood-red leaves in all its terrible glory. They beheld the screaming face of Rhaegar Targaryen, etched into the lines of the tree for all eternity, for all to see and fear. And the watchers on the wall felt afraid, fearful of the wrath of those lords of the north that sat on their horses beside the tree. As one, the lords of the north turned their backs on the city and trotted back to the disciplined lines of horsemen that sat far away, amassed and ready for an attack on the city walls. They left behind the tree, a warning to all who would ever lay eyes on it to fear the wrath of the north, to fear the dire wolf's bite. Rhaegar Targaryen's screaming face acted as a silent sentinel, condemned to watch over the city of his ancestors for all eternity, even as his family lost the city and kingdom they had built and ruled for over 280 years. The watchers on the wall trembled on the walls as the line of horsemen began to advance on the walls. If not even the last dragon could stand against these vengeful men from the lands of winter, what hope had mortal men? The Starks has ruled the north for 8,000 years as kings. They had bowed to dragons, but the dragons were gone and Rhaegar Targaryen was destined to a mockery of life as a tree. The entire Targaryen dynasty rested on the shoulders of a madman who had caused this problem in the first place, a 3-year-old boy that was hiding on Dragonstone and another infant who was not likely to survive the day. The Targaryen cause was doomed. There was no use fighting for a dynasty that could not fight for themselves. The Watcher made a decision then and threw down his bow and shrugged off his sword, before turning and running into the city. Into the city to ditch his armor and the incriminating 3-headed dragon that sat on it, and hopefully to find somewhere that would allow him to survive the slaughter that was surely to come. Behind him he heard the yells of his commanders as they tried to install order into their men. Men that had decided to follow his example if the sounds of falling steel and running feet were anything to go by. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw the entire line of green boys and old men that were manning the wall melting away, fleeing from the monsters that had come down from the north riding on the winds of winter, blowing away all who stood in their way. Davos v. Davos guided his little boat up the Blackwater Rush and into the docks outside the Mudgate. He slipped off the boat and into the fish markets. Byrne had sworn that he had a contact in a house near here. Davos followed the directions Byrne had given him and found himself outside of a house that seemed to be on the verge of falling over. He knocked on the door 3 times, as Byrne had instructed, and after a moment it opened to reveal an old bearded man that was missing a few teeth. "Who are you?" he asked as he squinted at Davos suspiciously. "I come bearing greetings from an old friend." "Which one?" "Captain Salty." The old man smiled toothlessly before gesturing for him to come in. "How is my old friend?" "Good," Davos replied as he stepped into the small abode. Come, the man said as he shuffled into the back room. "The team assembled for you is downstairs." "Downstairs?" Davos asked as he followed the man. "Yeah," the old man said as he opened a cupboard to reveal a false backing. It opened to reveal a steep and narrow staircase that led into the ground. The man shuffled to the side and gestured for him to step inside. "Just follow the steps down and they'll be waiting for you." "Are you not coming?" Davos asked. "Gods no," the man laughed, "I can't swing a sword as well as I once did and someone needs to watch the house." Davos nodded, before nervously descending down the stairs. The stairs twisted a few times but otherwise continued straight down. Davos saw torchlight in the distance and emerged from the staircase into a large, well-furnished room. In the center of the room was a large table with seats scattered around it. On the table was a hearty meal of roast beef and a leafy salad. Along one wall was a large fireplace with a chimney that went up into the roof, though to where Davos had no idea. Along the other wall was 2 doors, one of which was open, revealing what must have been the sleeping quarters of whoever lived here. He assumed it was the men who sat seated around the table, warriors all. They were dressed in strange steel armor that was inlaid with bronze, and helms with weirwood masks rested at their sides. All of them were armed to the hilt, each carrying a sword, bow, a quiver of arrows and a spear. The most disconcerting thing to see was the large wolves that lay at their feet, like any common dog would. There was 15 of them in total and Davos had no doubt that these men were killers. They turned to him as he entered the room, their hands drifting to their swords. "Who are you?" one of them asked, a ginormous man with hands the size of hams. In addition to his previous armaments, this man also had a giant warhammer strapped to his back. "I come from Captain Salty." Davos replied nervously, hoping Byrne hadn't chosen this moment to pull a joke on him. The men relaxed at his declaration and their hands drifted away from their swords. "You're the smuggler?" one asked. "I," Davos replied. "Good," the large man said as he extended a hand in greeting. "My name is Cregan." "Davos," Davos replied as he reached for the man's hand and shook it firmly. "What has Byrne told you so far?" "I'm rescuing some friends of yours." Cregan grimaced. "That is the essence of it, but it's gotten a little more complicated than that in the last few hours." "What do you mean?" Davos asked. "Tywin Lannister has finally decided to enter the war. His host is marching on the city now and will be here very soon. He has given orders to his men to kill our friends." From the way that Cregan said friends, Davos doubted they truly were. "Who are we rescuing?" Davos asked. "A few people. One of Brandon Stark's party is still alive in the Black Cells. His name is Ethan Glover. He will be the easiest to get out." Cregan smiled grimly then. "Our next orders are to capture Elia Martell and her children alive and get them out of the city." Davos swallowed. He wished Byrne had told him this. "As in Princess Elia Martell?" Davos asked weakly. "The one who married Rhaegar Targaryen?" "That exact one," Cregan confirmed. Inwardly Davos cursed Byrne Salt Stark's name. Eddard 14. The line of horsemen thundered towards the old gate, swords drawn in preparation for the coming fight that would occur within the city walls. Upon the battlements, the defenders' courage seemed to have deserted them, as many were throwing down their arms and fleeing off the walls and into the city to hide. Where were the Weirwood warriors? Ned thought as they drew closer and closer to the gates. They had been told to open the gates. As if in answer the gates began to creak open and the glint of bronze flashed from the top of the gate. Fighting began to break out on the gate and Ned saw many a bod wearing the three-headed dragon fall off the walls, lifeless. The gates were wide open now, revealing the inside of the city and the prize which two armies sought. Ned wondered if Tywin Lannister's forces had managed to enter the city yet. Next to him rode his father, the black knife that had killed Rhaegar hanging from his belt. Ned didn't know what to think of what his father had done. He hadn't been there when he had planned it and had no clue of his father's intentions until Rhaegar had been dragged into a circle of Crannog men earlier this morning. The show had at first made him feel sick to his stomach. Then the weirwood had grown from the blood and Ned's horror had shifted to awe. He had seen the gods exert their will upon the earth in front of him and it scared him a little bit. Now Ned had no clue what to think of it. The gates filled his vision and Ned pushed the thoughts from his mind. It would do no good to be distracted now, that could only lead to the death. His forces thundered through the gate and into the city proper, Ned leading them. Immediately the lords that had been given tasks began leading their men to rush off to do so. Ned watched Lord Bolton lead his men to the west to stop Tywin Lannister, while Great Jon Umber led his party to the south to secure the Guildhall of the Alchemists. The rest of his men secured the gatehouse and put down the paltry resistance. The Weirwood warriors were nowhere to be seen, having already melted away to carry out the restow of their duties. No, Ned corrected as he spotted one riding his way through the throng of men towards them. How Roderick Walton had gotten his White Hart into the city, Ned would never know, but it was here now with Roderick perched upon its back like one of the men from legends come to life. "Lord Stark," Roderick greeted as his heart pulled alongside Lord Rickard's own mount. "Lord Commander." Lord Rickard replied as he surveyed the mass of men marching into the city. He turned away from the gate and shifted his gaze to the west, where Tywin Lannister's forces lay. "Where is Tywin Lannister?" Lord Rickard asked. "He is approaching the gate now. They have opened it for him." Lord Rickard turned his gaze to the structure that sat overlooking it all, the Red Keep, where Aerys sat upon his throne. He turned to Ned and nodded towards the castle. "Shall we go?" he asked. Ned nodded and spurred his horse forward towards the Red Keep where his family's vengeance lay. Tywin 4. The goddamned Starks had beaten him to the city. Someone had opened the bloody gate for them and they had gotten in unhindered. Tywin would not roll over and die though, no. Aerys would still die at a Lannister's hands and Elia Martell would spend tomorrow evening rotting in a casket. Thank the gods the fools on the gates had opened the gates for him. It made it so much easier and quicker. His men had been pushed hard for the last hour in an attempt to reach the city. They were marching through the Gold Gate now, the sound of their marching feet filling the air. From the other side of the city came the yells of fighting men, and Tywine hoped the paltry defense would be able to delay Rickard Stark long enough. He looked for Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorque and saw them in the distance, riding hard for the Red Keep. As he had instructed, they had not stopped for anything and had been one of the first through the gates. His host was now through the gates and he nodded to the herald beside him. He blew the horn to signal the attack and his men's disciplined formations melted away. They attacked the Targaryen guards with reckless abandon, while more surged deeper into the city. Others headed into the nearby houses and shops and began the sack. The screams of the women and men whose homes were getting invaded began to fill the air, when another sound reached Tywine's ears. The drumming of hooves on cobblestones reverberated around them and Tywine searched for the source of the noise. He hadn't brought that many cavalry with him, only a few thousand, and most of them were still sitting in the square. Suddenly the streets to the east were filled with Lannister soldiers who only minutes before had gone running that way to sack the houses and shops. They were yelling and screaming and more than one was carrying a cut that was bleeding. There was a brief lull as the last of the Lannister soldiers fled from the streets in the east, and then the streets refilled with hundreds of horsemen driving his force back towards the gate. They flew the banners of the running direwolf alongside that of the flayed man, and Tywine knew who Rickard had sent to stop him. He saw the man now, at the front of his line, his sword hacking down at a soldier who was attempting to rape a woman in front of her house. The man's pale lifeless eyes raised from the corpse of Tywine Lannister's soldier and met Tywine's own steely gaze. Roose Bolton tipped his head in deference before turning to his men and yelling some orders at them. They rushed to obey, while Roose Bolton gathered some men and rode for Tywine's position. "Lord Lannister!" Lord Bolton greeted as he pulled his horse to a stop in front of him. "Tell me why I shouldn't strike your head from your shoulders right now." Tywine snapped. Roose Bolton smirked at him. "What would you strike my head from my shoulders for? You just killed my man." Roose Bolton nodded. "It's not my fault you lost control of your army." "What?" Tywine asked incredulously. "It's not my fault that you lost control of your army." Roose repeated stubbornly. "I did not." Tywine exclaimed in indignation. "Well then I suggest you start running, Lord Tywine." "Excuse me?" Tywine asked. "Start running. Rickard Stark is not the man you want to cross today." "And why not?" Tywine insisted. Roose Bolton just regarded him coldly before leaning in close. "Rickard Stark has already won the city, Lord Lannister. Get your troops back into formation now and you'll still have the chance to save face when he sits Robert's ass on the Iron Throne. The city is Rickard Stark's. He is one of the most brutal men I have ever seen. Do not get in his way by trying to steal the city that he sees as his to take." Tywine thought for a minute and then decided to change tactics. "Help me, Lord Bolton, and I will see you rewarded. I have lost control of my army and need assistance reorganizing them." Roose Bolton nodded smugly and Tywine gritted his teeth. At least Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorque had gotten away. Elia I. The sounds of fighting within the city was drifting up to Elia's place where she sat by the window. At her feet sat Rhaenys, playing with her black kitten that she had named Balerion. Nestled in her arms was her little baby Aegon, his sweet smile lifting Elia's downtrodden spirits. She glanced out her window, at the view overlooking the city, and watched the progress of the advancing hosts. It seemed Rickard Stark's host was winning the race as Tywine Lannister's men had been relegated to the parts of the city surrounding the Gold Gate. Truth be told, she didn't care anymore. When the conflict had first broken out, Elia had been so angry at Rhaegar for shaming her by running away with the Stark girl, but now she just didn't care anymore. Then she had gone through the stage where she wanted to put little Aegon on the throne, until she realized she wanted her children as far away from the twisted thing as possible. That accursed throne corrupted everyone it touched, and Elia wished her mother had not been as obsessed with it as she was. She wished her mother had allowed her to marry Arthur Dayne. He had been sweet and he would have been faithful to her. Their children would have been beautiful and kind, and Elia would have been content spending the rest of her life in his arms in a small keep on the shores of the summer sea. But that was not the deal that life had dealt her. She had married the gallant prince, but the prince wasn't gallant and the king was more malevolent than benevolent. She turned to the children's nursemaid who was quivering at every loud noise. "Go home," she said gently. "Go see your family, make sure they're safe." The girl nodded and all but fled from the room, having no intention of staying to make sure her princess and charges were safe. Elia couldn't blame her. If she had been in the same position she thought she would have fled too. She wished she could flee even now, but Aes had refused to let her go with the children, afraid that her brother's armies would betray him. The crazy old fool, she thought bitterly. There was a ship in the docks that was kept ready to flee at a moment's notice, but with each passing moment the chance to get to the ship alive shrunk. She turned back to the window and her heart almost stopped in her chest as a man clad in dark leathers climbed through. He reached out and grabbed her, covering her mouth. "Don't scream," he hissed in a strong northern burr. "I'm not here to harm you." Elia nodded fearfully, wondering what this northerner was doing. "I'm about to let you go. If you scream or yell you're going to die." Elia nodded again and the man slowly pulled his hand off her mouth and let her go. She scrambled away from him and retreated to the corner. She pulled Egon and Rhaenys close. "What do you want?" she asked. "I'm here to help," he replied. "There are certain men who want you dead. I am here to ensure you survive." "Why are you helping me?" she asked suspiciously. "My lord is close friends with a friend of yours. He promised to keep you safe." Elia thought for a second. "You mean Ned Stark?" she asked. The man nodded before raising his finger to his lips and hiding behind the door. Outside the herd of rushing feet could be heard. Elia jumped fearfully. She watched the man as the footsteps faded. She wondered if she could trust him. He said he came from Ned Stark, who Ashura said she was going to marry. But the last she had heard of Ned Stark was that he had married Catelyn Tully, breaking the promise to Ashura. Maybe he meant to make it up to Ashura by rescuing her from the clutches of the men who wanted her dead. She wondered who those men could be, though she assumed it was Rickard Stark. That was Ashura had told her, something about wanting to kill everyone who was present on the day he was burned. She wouldn't be surprised if Tywin Lannister wanted her dead too. He had always been upset that Aes had refused the match between Rhaegar and his daughter. The footsteps faded away and the man moved away from the door. He rushed over to the wall and began fiddling around with it, looking for something. He found what he was looking for with a triumphant grin and pushed on the stone. To Elia's great surprise, the wall opened like a door to reveal a dark passage. More men rushed out of the tunnel, though these were dressed differently. They wore strange bronze and steel armor and were all heavily armed. There was 4 of them. Behind them came a sight that made her heart break. It was 3 blood-stained sheets, containing what looked suspiciously like bodies. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Go and stand there," one of the men commanded, and Elia followed his instructions to stand in clear view of the door. She held Rhaenys and Egon in her arms. 2 of the men put down their loads and returned to the hallway, while the other 2 hid behind the door, their swords drawn. With a shock she realized their blades were made from the same strange ethereal material that Arthur's Dawn was made of. One of the men hiding behind the door turned to her. "When the door opens, one of the men who wants to kill you will enter. Run for the passage and don't stop. Do you understand?" Elia nodded, her heart thundering in her chest. For the next few minutes she stood there, praying to whatever gods would listen to protect her and her children. Outside, the sounds of running feet and yells filled the air. The door burst open and Elia turned to run. Eddard 15. Eddard rode hard beside his father, Roderick on his father's other side, and some of their most loyal men following him. They thundered through the streets of King's Landing, towards the Red Keep. He had no clue if Tywin Lannister's troops had been stopped, but he had yet to see some. They came across a few Targaryen guards, but most of them turned and ran rather than fought. The few that did stand to fight often died by one of Roderick Walton's arrows. The man was a one-man army, his bow singing a deadly song that killed any who tried to stop them. Ned hadn't even had to draw Snowfall yet. It still hung at his side, unblooded as of yet. He glanced up at the walls of the Red Keep and wondered if the Weirwood warriors had taken it yet. As of yet he could tell nothing, he saw no flashes of bronze in the early morning light to indicate otherwise. The citizens of King's Landing had stayed indoors on this day, so there was no one else impeding their progress as they ascended Egon's Hill, drawing ever closer to the Red Keep. They reached the summit and Ned was greeted by the sight of 2 Targaryen guards almost hacked in half. Ned had seen the Weirwood warriors fight at the Battle of God's Eye, an event that still haunted his nightmares, and he knew they would never be this messy. That could only mean one thing: Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorque had beaten them here. Ned and his father pushed on into the Red Keep, ignoring the bodies of the fallen. Ned saw a young girl fleeing and snatched her arm as she tried to run away. "The princess's chambers," he roared in his desperation, "where are they?" The girl, most probably terrified beyond her wits, just raised a trembling finger and pointed to a nearby doorway. "Up there?" Ned asked. "Is that where she is?" The girl nodded and Ned let her go, heading for the doorway. She rushed away as far away as her legs could carry her and Ned rushed off as fast as he could go. Behind him his father and Roderick sought out the great hall where their walks had reported Aerys was spending his last hours, brooding as rebels took his city. Ned thundered through the tower door and up the steps, the remaining soldiers following him. They reached the landing and Ned saw Amory Lorque smashing down a door. The man hadn't relayed Ned was present and pushed his head into the room. He backed out and moved to the next door, while Gregor Clegane emerged from another doorway shaking his great head. "She's not in here," he rumbled. Amory moved to the final door and pushed it open and Ned heard a woman scream. Amory dashed into the room and Ned rushed forward to engage Gregor Clegane. "Clegane!" he roared as he made his presence known. The mountain who rides turned away from the doorway and turned to engage Ned and his men. Amory had entered the room and the door had shut behind him, blocking Ned seeing what was going on inside. He could only hope and pray the Weirwood warriors and Burn Salt Stark had done as asked. Sir Gregor swung his massive sword, but in the cramped corridor it was a largely ineffective weapon. It got caught on a wall scone and Ned and his men used it to their advantage, with one of Ned's men managing to hamstring the mountain. The mountain fell to the floor with a cry of rage and Ned dashed past him and into the room. He was immediately greeted by the sight of a star steel blade held at his throat and he almost collapsed from relief. "Thank the gods," he murmured as the sword was pulled away and Ned embraced Cregan in a crushing hug. He looked about the room and spotted Amory's corpse lying on the floor. "Where is she?" he asked as he looked down the tunnel for her. "Here," a voice said and Elia Martell walked from the tunnel, her children clutched in her arms. She was still as beautiful as she had been at the tourney of Harrenhal, Ned reflected, though she was a fair bit thinner. "You need to go," Ned said. "We're not out of the woods yet." Elia nodded and Cregan and his men turned and rushed out of the room, the stone door clicking shut behind them. He grabbed his blade and thrust it through Amory Lorque, wetting the blade, before turning and leaving the room, shutting the door behind him. He looked down the corridor to see Gregor Clegane still on the floor, held at the point of multiple swords. He gestured for 2 of his men to guard the door before advancing down the corridor and stopping next to Gregor Clegane's head. He wrenched the mountain's helmet off and slammed down the pommel of his sword on his head. It took 3 blows before he was properly concussed. "Go and get some more men," he told one man, "get this scum out of here and lock him in the black cells." Davos 6. Davos followed the men into the tunnels beneath King's Landing, tunnels he did not know even existed. The tunnel had begun in the house in the fish markets and ran all over the city. Davos had seen more offshoots than he cared to count, and wondered if the men in front of him knew where they going. They had entered a particularly dark tunnel before Davos found himself in a small round chamber, which lay at the bottom of a shaft where a dozen tunnels met. Davos looked down and noticed a scuffed mosaic of the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen, done in tiles of black and red. To one side of the small chamber, there was an ornate iron brazier fashioned in the shape of a dragon's head. "Well, this is where we part," Cregan said as he shook Davos's hand once more. "I'll see you back here in a little while." Davos nodded and the group of men split. 3 of them went with Cregan, while the other 4 took another passage and gestured for Davos to follow. Davos followed them and soon got lost in the twisting turning mazes that seemed to have no end. They eventually stopped before a plain stone slab and Davos groaned inwardly. "Did we get lost?" he asked. "No," the man at the front said. Then he reached up and tapped something near the right-hand corner of the stone slab. To Davos' amazement, the stone slab around to reveal a doorway into a place Davos had only heard of. "This is the Black Cells," he whispered. The men nodded grimly and stepped forward into the corridor, past the empty cells. Davos followed and ahead noticed a light in the distance. The men stuck to the shadows, their strange pale swords drawn, and glittering in the dim light. They slipped up the corridor like wraiths and fell upon the guards that were stationed there. They fought like demons, and within seconds the 4 of them had managed to kill the 10 guards that guarded the cell. Another 4 men emerged from within the cell, their swords drawn, but they fell as quick as the other guards had. Davos and the men rushed inside to see a young boy of 15 years chained hand and foot to the wall. His face was swollen, and he sported many cuts and bruises. "Go away," he murmured, "I don't know anything. I was just his squire." "Ethan?" one of the men asked. The boy looked up and Davos' heart almost broke within his chest. His eyes were so defeated, so broken that Davos doubted this boy had the spirit within him to live. "Who are you?" he slurred through his most probably broken jawbone. "The gates of Mount Starpoint are open." The words meant nothing to Davos, but they clearly meant something to the boy who looked at the men within a new light. "The gates are opened?" he asked incredulously. "I." The boy began laughing then, and it filled the cell and corridor echoing around them. "Brandon shall be avenged," he crowed. "Brandon shall be avenged." The men glanced at each other and stepped forward, before swinging their blades at the chains that bound him. The chains sparked before snapping and falling away. The men grasped the boy in their arms and dragged him from the cell, while he continued to laugh like a maniac. They descended back down the way they had come, and when they got to the chamber with the dragon mosaic, Davos found Cregan waiting for them along with a young Dornish woman and her 2 young children. "Hello," Davos greeted as he nodded at her. "I'm Davos." She smiled at him sweetly. "Hello Davos," she said. "I'm Elia." Then Davos realized who was speaking to and his heart stopped in his chest. "PP Princess," he stammered before dropping to one knee. Elia Martell smiled down at him. "Not for much longer, good sir." "I'm no sir," Davos said as he got back to his feet. "Just a smuggler." "Oh," Elia replied. "Mama." The little girl at the princess's feet called, "What's a smuggler?" Elia smiled down at the little girl. "A very good sailor." The little girl skipped over to Davos and clutched his hand in her small one. "Will you be my friend?" she asked. "I've never had a smuggler for a friend." Davos smiled down at her. "Of course I will," he replied. "I've never had a princess for a friend before." The little girl smiled at him sweetly and Davos felt an odd urge of affection for the fallen princess. "We need to go," Cregan said as he led the way down the corridor that led back to the house in the fish markets. The return seemed to be quicker than the journey in for Davos, and they found themselves at the fish markets relatively quickly. They stopped very briefly to change into some more suitable clothes for sneaking through the poor districts of town, before ascending to the surface. "This is where we depart, Davos," Cregan said as he shook his hand. "Maybe I'll see you back in the north." Davos nodded and shook his hand, before turning to the princess. "It's best we get going now," he said, and the princess nodded, her Dornish skin and thick black tresses hidden by the ragged cloak that covered her. They crept their way through the fish markets and made it to Davos's little boat in good time. Thankfully, due to the battle going on within the city, the streets had been largely deserted, so they had been seen by few. As they pulled out of the docks, Elia gestured to another boat pulling out from the docks, a big 3-masted war galley flying the standards of House Targaryen. "That boat was supposed to take me and my family to Dragonstone," she said with a hint of bitterness. Davos glanced at it, and then out to the deeper water where he knew Bern Saltstark and his fleet lurked. "Just as well you didn't then," Davos replied. "Why is that, Davos?" she asked, and Davos gestured out to the deep water. "Bern Saltstark has specific orders to sink that ship." "Who is Bern Saltstark?" the princess asked, and Davos stared at her incredulously. "You've never heard of Bern Saltstark?" he exclaimed. "No," she replied. "Should I?" "Most probably not," Davos replied with a grin. I only know him because he spent a lot of time chasing me. Ah. The princess said as she smirked at him knowingly. Davos replied. He was a bloody pain in my ass. What's an ass? Rhaenys asked as she stirred in Elia's grip. Damn, Davos muttered as the princess giggled at him. Jaime stood beside the throne as the rebels entered the city. Aerys had descended into a fit of madness, jumping at every shadow and scaring at every sound. He was constantly having reports on the rebels' progress brought to him. It seemed that two rival armies had reached the city at the same time. One army was commanded by his father, the other by Rickard Stark. Rickard Stark's forces had managed to enter first, but not before sacrificing Rhaegar Targaryen to the weirwood tree that had miraculously sprung up outside the old gate. Aerys had ordered the gates opened for his father, and Tywin Lannister's forces had entered the city, upon which time they turned their cloaks and in a stunning display began to sack the city. In an even further stunning display, Roose Bolton had led a force of northern men to attack Tywin Lannister and stop him from sacking the city, while other northern lords secured other points of interest. Somehow after Roose Bolton attacked, Tywin had reordered his men, and it had begun a much more orderly invasion of the city, clearing it of Targaryen soldiers street by street. Not that they would have much competition. Most of the men had left with Rhaegar to confront Rickard Stark on the Trident. Very few of those men had returned, and those who did came sporting tales of an army so numerous it was like fighting the ocean. No one had seemed to know what had happened to Rhaegar, but as this morning's event had proven, the Starks had managed to capture him alive. Before the throne now was the hand of the king, Wisdom Rossart. Light the wildfire caches. Aerys ordered the man, and the man bowed low and left. Sir Jaime. Aerys called, and Jaime took his place on bended knee before the Iron Throne. My king. Jaime said. Bring me the head of your father. Aerys commanded, and Jaime got to his feet before turning and rushing down the great hall, though whether he was going to take his father's head or kill Wisdom Rossart he did not know. He left the hall and stopped almost immediately. What was he meant to do, Jaime wondered. Did he honor his oaths to his king or his oaths as a knight? What would Arthur Dayne do? Jaime asked himself, but for the life of him he could not figure it out. He cursed the White Eye for failing to kill the king and allowing him to blow the city up. He cursed his father for putting him in this position. He cursed Rhaegar for not deposing Aerys earlier. He cursed them all, and all the oaths they wanted him to stand by. He would not stand by as hundreds of thousands of innocent people were killed by the commands of a madman and his lackeys. Jaime drew his white sword and rushed down the corridor after Wisdom Rossart. He caught up with the elderly man just before he had reached the exit into the courtyard. Sir Jaime. The man exclaimed. What are you doing? Wordlessly Jaime grabbed the man by the front of his tunic and ran him through with his blade. The man stiffened in his grip, before falling off his sword and collapsing to the ground, his lifeblood pouring out of him. With a heavy heart, Jaime turned around and made his way back to the hall. When he opened the door, his heart almost stopped in relief. The rafters were filled with all sorts of birds, eagles, ravens, sparrows, and one very distinctive white raven. At the foot of the stairs to the Iron Throne, sat a snake, watching the man who was perched upon it. It turned its head as the doors opened and regarded Jaime with its black eyes. It hissed at him before turning and slithering away. No! Jaime cried. What are you doing? Kill him! He cried as he gestured to the king on his throne. The snake just hissed at him once more before slithering away and disappearing into the shadows. Sir Jaime! Aerys cried as he beheld the blood on his white sword. Whose blood is that? Up in the rafters the birds began to laugh, and above it all Jaime could hear the cries of that damned white raven, cackling at the situation Jaime was in. Wisdom Rossart's Jaime replied as he turned his gaze to the king. The king's eyes widened in realization and he got to his feet and rushed down the stairs. Jaime wondered if the king planned to attack him, but to his alas, the king instead turned and went to flee. Jaime sprung after him and caught a hold of his long white hair. With tears in his eyes, he stabbed the king he had sworn to protect through the heart. Crying in agony, Sir Jaime, a knight of the king's guard, removed his white sword from the chest of his king. The king slumped to his knees, his blood spilling onto the red floor, eerily similar to the way that Brandon Stark's blood had spilled when he had been dragged before the court on the first day he had entered the city. The king fell to the floor, his eyes searching for Jaime. "Traitor," he murmured, "like your father." The king never finished his sentence, instead passing out from the lack of blood. His eyes became glassy as his wheezing chest stopped rising. The king was dead. Jaime felt weak suddenly and decided he needed to take a seat. Unfortunately there was only one seat in the entire room, the twisted mess that was called the Iron Throne. He staggered over to the steps leading up to its dais when the sound of falling metal filled the air. Jaime spun around, his sword still dripping the blood of his king. From the shadows at the back of the hall, two figures emerged and one of them began to slowly clap. His claps echoed in the emptiness of the great hall, filling Jaime's head with a mocking applause of what he had just done. "Behold!" the Burnt Lord yelled as he emerged into the light. "The truest knight of the Kingsguard." Jaime glared at the man who had caused all this trouble. He was dressed in plain dark grey plate, but his helm had been left off, and his gauntlets were missing, exposing the horrible burn scars that covered him. Over his shoulder sat his house's Valyrian steel greatsword, Ice, a chunk of metal that would be deadly in the hands of even an adequate swordsman. Next to him strode a man dressed in straw steel and bronze plate, with a helm of weirwood. At his side rested a sword, on his back sat a bow and in his hands sat a spear. Jaime's sword itched in his arm. "You killed Rhaegar," he accused Rickard Stark. "I." Rickard Stark replied bluntly. "And you killed Aerys." Jaime's sword arm quavered and he sat down upon the dais. "I." he replied. "I did." "Perhaps your finest act," Rickard said, and Jaime glared at him. "Do not mock me," he hissed at the Burnt Lord. "I'm not," Rickard replied. "I see you've learned the lesson that all northern boys learn." "And what's that?" Jaime challenged. "The oaths of knighthood mean nothing. There is a reason there are no knights in the north." Jaime turned his gaze away but switched it back when he heard a hissing. The snake that had confronted Aerys earlier slithered from the shadows to meet Rickard Stark. It climbed up the Burnt Lord's leg before draping itself over his shoulders. "You?" Jaime realized with a start. "You're the one with the snake. Why didn't you kill him?" "I wanted to see what you would do. You let me break my oaths. I let you fulfill your oaths. I thought knights protected the innocent. How is protecting the innocent allowing them to burn in wildfire?" Jaime's jaw dropped open. "You knew?" he asked. "You knew and still you came. Why?" Even if you had chosen to let Wisdom Rossart go, he would not have survived his visit to the first cache. My men got into the city a few days ago and secured all the sites. Jaime felt heartbroken. All the arguing with himself had been for nothing. No one was ever in any danger. He couldn't believe it. He had killed the king for nothing. It left a bitter taste in his mouth. "Who are you?" Jaime asked as he glanced at the other man. "Rodrik." The man replied simply and Jaime nodded. Rickard Stark ascended to where Jaime sat upon the floor and lowered himself to the floor beside him. "Kid," he began, "what you did today that took more courage and honor than the rest of every knight who ever lived had." "I killed an old man," Jaime said. "You killed a madman who had doomed the realm to war, and this city to death. You did a good thing." "I did not," Jaime replied. "You did," Rickard Stark insisted. "Do not let anyone tell you are anything other than honorable. You are a Kingslayer, yes, but the most honorable Kingslayer to have lived." "I am not," Jaime insisted. "I'll admit," Rickard said as he placed his hand on Jaime's shoulder. "When I entered the city today I had every intention of killing you." "You did?" Jaime asked. "Yes," Rickard replied. "You had stood by and watched as my son was killed and I was burnt alive. What sort of honorable man does that? What knightly oaths tell a man to stand by and watch as another is burned alive? What you did today proved you have more honor than any of the other Kingsguard alive." Sir Gerald Hightower guarded the king as he descended into madness. Sir Barristan stood by and watched as he tore the realm apart. Sir Arthur and Sir Oswell are rumored to have helped Rhaegar kidnap a 16-year-old girl. Where is their honor? Jaime listened in sullen silence. You had honor enough though, honor that made you turn from a boy that stood by and watched to a man that stepped up and stopped the madness of an utterly abhorrent king. You are the youngest of the Kingsguard, but you are more honorable than the rest of them combined, I say. Yes, you killed a king, but you did it for honorable reasons. Wear what you have done with pride, Sir Jaime. Today you made the hardest choice of all and chose right. With that, Rickard Stark got to his feet and pulled Jaime up alongside him. Now come, Rickard said, soon these halls will be filled with the victorious lords. You don't want to be remembered as the Kingsguard who snivelled before them. Do not let them judge you for what you have done. You are above them. By what right do the sheep judge the lion? Jaime smiled then, smiled at the memories that phrase instilled. Days when he was still in Casterly Rock with Tyrion and Cersei and his father, before the Mad King had dragged him away to hell, before the madness had consumed the realm. Jaime squared his shoulders and straightened his spine. He had no reason to be ashamed. He had saved them all from death. By what right did they judge him? By what right did the sheep judge the lion? And Jaime was the truest lion of them all. Chapter 50, Tywine 3, After the Sack. Summary. Tywine has a poke. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. Tywine settled into the stiff wooden chair that sat behind the desk in the offices of the Master of Coin. This was not where Tywine belonged or should have been. Tywine should have been sitting in the King's Solar, upon the plush leather armchair, but that had been taken by Rickard Stark. He should have been residing in the Tower of the Hand, but those apartments, and the offices that came with them had been taken by Eddard Stark. Everywhere Tywine looked, all he could see was the running direwolf. It hung from the walls of the Red Keep. It sat on the breastplates of the soldiers who manned the walls of the city and patrolled the streets. Tywine's own army had been forced to set up camp outside the city, while the Stark men had gotten to take over the local barracks and stables. It was an insult to the Lannister name to have the Lannister armies sitting in tents while the Stark soldiers lay in feather beds. The Stark army was numerous though, and Tywine had no idea where Rickard Stark had managed to get the men, let alone the horses. He hadn't believed it at first when his outrider had told him the entire Stark army was composed of cavalry. Then he had seen it with his own eyes, and was amazed. Tywine had to admit he had a grudging respect for the man they called the Burnt Lord. He had accomplished what Tywine had strived to do for years in a matter of months. Then he had scorned Tywine in the same way that Aes had. Tywine had requested to meet with him last night, but the Burnt Lord had refused and instead directed him to Roose Bolton. The message was clear. Rickard Stark had no interest in meeting with Tywine Lannister, nor anything the Lord of Casterly Rock had to say. Tywine had moved on though, he had bigger fish to fry. The door opened and in limped Gregor Clegane. The man they called the Mountain Who Rides slumped into the chair across from Tywine with a gasp of relief. What happened? Tywine asked. Stark. Gregor spat shortly. Explain. Tywine demanded. We got there first, but Ned Stark arrived not long after. Amory found the girl and went to kill her while I went to stop Stark. Amory got into her room and Stark got past me and followed him in. I was taken captive by Stark's guards and thrown in the black cells once they had taken the city. And what of the princess? Tywine asked. Did she die? I don't know. Gregor replied. You don't know? Tywine exclaimed. Gregor shrugged. The door shut behind Amory. I couldn't see. Tywine sighed. He had no way of knowing what had happened to the princess now. I assume Amory is dead then. I don't know. Gregor replied, but he wasn't put in the cells with me. Tywine clenched his jaw. This day was getting worse and worse. Page. He called, and the young boy that acted as his page dashed into the room. Yes, Lord. The boy asked. Go and find Rickard Stark and ask him if he knows where Amory Lorke is. At once, Lord. The boy rushed out of the room to find Rickard Stark and Tywine turned back to Gregor. I want you to take your men and go home. Get out of here before the Starks decide they want your head too. The great man nodded, before getting up and rushing away. Tywine continued to sit at his desk while he waited for the return of his page. A few minutes later the boy returned and entered his room. Well? Tywine asked. He said he is dead and to stop annoying him. Tywine's brow rose. To stop annoying him. Yes, the little boy replied. Tywine rose from his chair with such force that it was thrown backwards. Get out! He roared. The boy scrambled away and Tywine pitched his goblet of wine at the wall. Rickard Stark thought he owned this city. Rickard Stark thought he would be able to do what he wanted just because he was the leader of this bloody rebellion. Tywine would show him. He stormed out of his chambers and down into the courtyard of the Red Keep where his personal guard awaited him. The captain of his guard stepped forward. My lord. He greeted. Get word to our contacts within the city. Tywine demanded. I want to know everything that happened to Elia Martell. Question servants, commoners, highborn hostages, whoever we can get our hands on. I want to know if she is still alive, and if not I want to know where her body is. I want to know absolutely everything she did in the last week. The captain nodded and began relaying his instructions to his guards, who rushed away to do his bidding. Tywine turned around and stormed back up to his offices. When he got there he found his son waiting for him. Jaime Lannister rose from the seat he had taken to greet his father with a curt nod. He was still wearing that accursed white cloak that Aerys had given him. Tywine strode past him and put his chair back where it belonged and sitting in it. Sit. Tywine commanded. Jaime sat down before reaching over and pouring himself a goblet of wine. They say you killed the king. Tywine began. He noticed a hint of defiance enter his son's eyes. I did. Jaime confirmed. Good. Tywine replied. I'm glad he died at the hands of a Lannister. At least we beat the Starks to something. Jaime shifted in his seat and took a long sip of his wine. Yeah. Jaime replied non-committedly. Now we can talk about reinstating you as my heir and getting rid of that white cloak. Tywine continued. Jaime frowned at him. Tyrion is your heir. Jaime said. I'm of the Kingsguard. My oaths were for life. Tywine laughed at his son. You broke your oaths when you killed Aerys. Jaime scowled at him. I did nothing of the sort. I kept my oaths. Really? Tywine mocked. Tell me how killing the king you had sworn to protect was keeping your oaths. Rickard Stark said I did the right thing. Jaime said in a small voice. He said I had more honor than any of the Kingsguard alive. Tywine scoffed. Rickard Stark is an absolute idiot. Jaime smirked at him. Rickard Stark is the absolute idiot whose troops hold this city. Rickard Stark is the absolute idiot that crushed Rhaegar on the Trident. Rickard Stark is the absolute idiot who survived Aerys' madness. I would say Rickard Stark is a pretty extraordinary idiot. Tywine scowled at the cheek of his son. He got lucky. Jaime laughed at him then. Luck had nothing to do with it. Enough. Tywine demanded. Regardless, you will become my heir. I will not. Jaime replied. I am a Kingsguard. I will continue to guard the king. The king is dead, you fool. I will wait for Robert's judgment then. I will pressure him to make you my heir. Even if he strips me of my white cloak I will still refuse. Tyrion is your heir. That stunted demon monkey will never be my heir. Jaime glared at him. That stunted demon monkey is my brother. Jaime's eyes drifted away, unseeing. You've already made me betray him once. I will not betray him again. Tywine scoffed. I saved him from a whore. Jaime got to his feet. I see this conversation is going nowhere. He bowed low, so low it was almost mocking. I will take my leave of you. Tywine glared at his son. Get out then. Enjoy your life guarding the king. He spat. I will find myself worthy of Casterly Rock and the legacy of my family. Jaime laughed at him again. Your legacy, he muttered before turning and walking out of the door. It was hours later when the investigation he had sent his guards on yielded results. His captain came to him accompanied by a young girl of about 17. Tell Lord Tywine what you saw. His captain commanded the girl and she nodded meekly. I saw the princess. The girl stammered. She was in the fish markets with an old man. How do you know it was the princess? Tywine asked. I work in the keep, Lord. I normally live just down the hill, but with your armies coming my auntie reckoned it would be safer in the fish markets cause it was outside the city. I work in the kitchens and I seen her a few times. She was wearing old clothes and a ragged cloak but I seen her enough to know. Did she have anyone with her apart from the old man? Yes, she had a little girl and she was carrying something else in her arms. Tywine nodded. This was good. There was still a chance to place himself at the forefront of this war, and show Robert his commitment to his regime. Chapter 51, Eddard 14, New Friends, Old Foes. Summary. Ned has a meeting with a certain smuggler and princess. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. Eddard Stark had left the city early that morning with only the small Cranogman Howland Reed for company. Howland had been Ned's constant companion throughout the entirety of the war, following him wherever he had gone. Ned knew few people, if any, he trusted more. Howland had been there when the Smiles died at Harrenhal, and had a devotion to House Stark that extended beyond his duties as a vassal. Which was why Ned had chosen Howland to accompany him on this day. They had left King's Landing via the Iron Gate, and headed up the coast for a few leagues, to an isolated cove. In the cove a ship was anchored, while a small camp had been set up on the beach. Even from this distance, Ned could recognize the telltale markings of the Salty Wolf, the flagship of the Eastern Fleet and the ship captained by Bern Saltstock. Ned and Howland made their way down into the cove and approached the camp. They were greeted by Bern as soon as their horses' hooves hit the sand. He had run over from his camp and threw his arms around Ned as soon as he had dismounted. "Ned, brother!" he exclaimed. "It's been too long since I've seen such a somber face." Ned cracked a small smile, but he noticed that Bern's eyes did not dance as they once did. There was a sadness, a hardness that resided in them that made Ned wonder what had upset his old friend so. Bern was no stranger to conflict, having fought pirates in the Narrow Sea and chasing smugglers all over the Bight. "How have you been, Bern?" Ned asked. "How was Storm's End?" Bern's gaze darkened even further and a scowl flickered across his normally jovial features. "Hard, Ned," Bern replied before swallowing thickly. Tears sprung into his eyes and his gaze drifted to the horizon. "I lost my brothers," he said in a small voice. "One was on a ship sunk by the Red Wine Fleet, while the other died after the falling of the smuggler's ship. I'm my father's last son now. I'm so sorry," Ned consoled, knowing exactly how Bern felt. Losing Brandon had been hard enough, and Bern had just lost both of his brothers. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Bern nodded, and the three of them began to walk down to the camp. "How was Stannis?" Ned asked, and Bern's grief-stricken features twisted into an angry scowl that Ned didn't know Bern had in him. "He was a stiff prick. I wish we had have just let him die." Ned was surprised at the extent of Bern's anger. "What happened?" "At first he refused to allow the northern soldiers into the castle, but he took our fish and grains. The smuggler, Davos, convinced him to take the soldiers, and then he cut off Davos' fingers for his crimes as a smuggler." Ned balked. He had always heard Robert say that Stannis was a hard and stern boy, but to hear of the results was quite confronting. "You did your duty well," Ned said. "I will make sure Davos is also well rewarded." Bern nodded. "Make him the lord of a keep on the sea, preferably one within my own dominion. He has a good head on his shoulders, and deserves a large reward for what he has done." Ned nodded at Bern. "I'll see what I can do. If I remember correctly, the Lord of the Isle of Salt was killed at the Battle of the Trident. I think it would suit him well." Bern nodded, agreeing with him. The Isle of Salt was a small isle within the Bight that sat a few leagues in front of the entrance to the Saltsmoor, and while it was not a large island by any means, it was extremely profitable, sitting in the middle of three major trading routes and having extensive salt flats that had made the previous lord quite rich. It had a small trading town called Light Harbour and a lighthouse that guided the ships towards the moor. It also had a small fleet of 5 ships that the previous lord of the isle had used for trading. "A good keep," Bern said before cracking a small grin, "though I'm not sure how I feel about giving it to a former smuggler, especially one that knows how to get through the Wolf's Moor without a pilot." Ned looked at him incredulously. "Is this smuggler the one that you told me about?" Bern nodded. He's quite an extraordinary man, one of the best sailors I've ever met. He must be, Howland chimed in, if he got through the Wolf's Moor without a pilot. They had reached the camp and Bourne led them to a large tent next to the central campfire. Bourne strode over to the tent and pulled the door aside for them to enter. Ned walked in and looked around, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim interior. As his eyes adjusted, Ned noticed the tent's occupants. Sitting on a bench was the princess, her young son cradled in her arms. She looked the same as she had a few nights ago, though her long hair was unwashed and the fine clothes she had been wearing then were replaced by more ragged ones. On the floor on the other side of the tent was an old man and a little girl. They seemed to be playing with some bits of rope, and Ned's spirits lifted to see the little girl smiling. The last time he had seen her she had been on the verge of crying. The eyes of the tent's occupants shifted to Ned as they noticed his presence. The old man got up off the floor and wandered over to him. He held out a calloused hand for Ned to shake. "Davos Lord." The man greeted in a strong flea-bottom accent. Ned glanced at Bourne. "So this is the man you've told me about?" Bourne nodded and Ned returned his gaze to the man. "Thank you for your services to House Stark during this war." Davos shrugged. "I was already going to do most of what I did then." He frowned at the princess, though I had no plans to rescue a princess. I was going to leave that to the gallant knights. Beside him Bourne stiffened. "There's no such thing as gallant knights." He spat, before turning away and muttering about fucking Reachman. Ned nodded and gestured for Davos to take a seat at the table within the tent. "We have much to talk about." Davos sat down and Ned sat across from him. The princess shifted in her seat, so she was facing Ned and Ned nodded to her. She smiled back at him and Ned turned his gaze to the little girl who had come and sat beside Davos. Ned smiled at her and she shyly ducked beneath the table. Davos coaxed the girl out. "Say hello to Lord Stark." He told her and she said a small hello. Ned turned his gaze back to Davos before pouring them both a goblet of wine. "Bourne tells me you lost your fingers," Ned said as he handed Davos a goblet. Davos winced and pulled off his left glove. He held up his hand for Ned to see, and the shortened stumps of his fingers wiggled at Ned. "I'm sorry," Ned said as he took a sip of his own wine. Davos shrugged. "It's life." Bourne said he also promised you something for your services. "What was it?" Ned asked. "He said he'd give my sons opportunities," Davos said with a hint of defiance. Ned nodded. "What sort of opportunities?" "Squiring." Ned nodded again. "That's good." "It is," Davos replied. "It's more than I could ever hope to give them." "Maybe not," Ned replied. "I hear you're a man of the sea." "I am," Davos replied. "Have you heard of the Isle of Salt?" Davos nodded. "In the Bight." "Get down on one knee," Ned commanded as he drew his new blade. Davos frowned at him, confused. Lord?" he asked. "Get down on one knee," Ned commanded in his best lord voice and Davos complied quickly. Ned got up from his seat and strode around to where Davos knelt. He held out his blade. "Place your hand on the blade," Ned instructed and Davos followed his instructions. In the north, star steel is considered a holy and sanctified, a gift from the gods to men. If you swear an oath on this blade it is as binding as swearing an oath before a heart tree. Do you understand? "I understand," Davos replied. "Lord Davos of House," Ned began and waited for Davos to supply him with a name. Davos, unsure what was happening, did not follow the usual procedure. Thankfully, Bourne leaned in and told him what was going on. Davos' eyebrows rose in shock and his mouth fell open. "Lord Stark, really this is too much," he began, but Ned raised his hand. "Lord Davos of House," he repeated and Davos swallowed before glancing at Bourne who nodded encouragingly. "Seaworth," Davos stated and Ned nodded. "Lord Davos of House Seaworth. I hereby grant you the lands, titles and incomes of the Isle of Salt. Do you swear your fealty to Lord Saltstark?" "I do," Davos replied. "Do you swear to advise him, aid him and follow his instructions?" "I do," Davos replied. "Do you swear to follow him in times of peace and war?" I do. Do you so swear it be earth and water? I swear it by earth and water. Do you so swear it by bronze and iron? I swear it by bronze and iron. Do you so swear it by ice and fire? I swear it by ice and fire. Davos finished and Ned nodded. Then rise, Lord Davos Seaworth of the Isle of Salt, Keeper of the Light and Lord of the Light Harbor. Davos struggled to his feet, face red and sputtering about how he wasn't worthy of the honor and was just a commoner. Ned smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. You will make a fine lord. In the North we judge men on the merits of their actions, not the prestige of their names. Byrne and Howland nodded solemnly, before Byrne's facade cracked and he embraced Davos in a tight hug. Come! He exclaimed. Let us go and drink to your new appointment, Lord Seaworth. The two men left the tent conversing over Davos' new holdings, leaving Ned and Howland alone with the princess and her children. Rhaenys had gone back to playing with the ropes on the floor and the little baby Aegon was sleeping in the princess's arms. Ned turned back to her and took a seat across from her. Howland sat beside him and Ned swallowed, dreading the coming conversation. He was unsure how she would take it and the uncertainty did not sit well with Ned. Thankfully the princess chose to initiate the conversation. Thank you for saving my life, Lord Stark. She began. I know my family has done much wrong by yours, and I would like to apologize for it. Ned frowned at her. Have the Martells done something I'm not aware of? She smiled at him sadly. Most probably, but I was talking of the other side of my family, the one my husband came from. Ah! Ned said, catching on to what the princess was saying. They are your good family, princess, you are not responsible for their crimes. Regardless, it was a tragedy what happened to your family. It was. Ned agreed. But I am not here to lament over the many tragedies that have befallen my family over the last 2 years. Of course not. The princess said as she lowered her gaze to her sleeping son. Are you going to hand me to your friend now? I'm not sure. Ned replied. To be honest, I have no clue what to do with you now that I've rescued you. You could send me back to Dorne. Ned shook his head. You don't understand, princess. The world thinks you're dead. My men framed it that way for a reason. I heard your father wanted to kill me. Ned shrugged. He did once upon a time, when his wounds were still fresh and his grief was still young. I don't think he does anymore. Tywin Lannister wants me dead. Ned nodded and winced. He does. The princess laughed. He always was bitter that Aes had passed over his daughter for me. I met her once, you know. Ned shook his head. I didn't. We traveled to Casterly Rock seeking marriages for me and possibly Oberyn. We got there shortly after Joanna Lannister had died giving birth to Tyrion. My mother breached the subject of marriage between Oberyn and Cersei Lannister to Tywin, but he flatly refused, telling her that Cersei was going to marry Rhaegar. My mother got the last laugh, it seemed, when I married Rhaegar instead of Cersei, but with Tywin you never know. Now his daughter will most likely be queen if your sister isn't found. He must be feeling quite smug at the moment. Perhaps. Ned conceded, though I doubt it with the way my father's been treating him. The princess smirked then. Yes. She said, I hear your father is living up to his reputation as the Burnt Lord. Ned shifted uncomfortably. Some days he wasn't sure how he felt about the man his father had become in the aftermath of his burning. What are you going to do with me? Elia asked as she noted Ned's discomfort. Ned sighed. For obvious reasons I can't send you back to Dorne. I'm already hearing murmurings that your brother is trying to raise a second host. If they got you and your children in their hands, they would be marching up the Bone Way within a moon's turn. Of course. Elia said, though Ned noted a hint of sadness had entered her eyes. For the same reasons I can't send you to Dragonstone with Rhaegar's son. The world thinks you, and your children dead. So where will I go? Elia asked. There are 2 options for the moment. Ned said. What are they? Elia asked. You can either travel to Greywater Watch with Lord Reed here. No one will ever find you there, and you will be afforded as much freedom as can be found on a floating keep within the middle of the neck. And the other option. You can go to Mount Starpoint, another keep within the north. In another life it would have belonged to me and Ashura, But that will not be happening anymore. You will be safe there, and in time I can organize for you to come to Winterfell. And what of my children? Elia asked. For now, they would go with you wherever you choose to go. And when they are older? In the north, all the children of high-ranking nobles within the north are fostered at Winterfell when they turn 4. I would extend the same offer to your children. I would raise them alongside my own sons and daughters. What would you tell everyone? That they are the bastards of one of Ashura's relations. I'm sure she would prove agreeable. She often spoke of her admiration and love for you. And shame and dishonor more than you already have. Elia asked with a bitter smile. What do you mean? Ned asked confused. She told me you promised to marry her. The last I had heard you married Catelyn Tully for her father's troops. Ned's mouth dropped open and he turned to Howland aghast, before turning back to Elia. I did not marry her. Ned exclaimed. Lord Hoster wanted me to, but I refused. Does she think I married Catelyn too? I could not say, my lord. By the time I had received this news I had already dismissed her. Dismissed her? Ned asked, when was this? Just after she got back from Gulltown. After your brother's wedding had been called off. Ned's mouth dropped open even further and his face flushed scarlet. She said she was going home to Starfall. Ned exclaimed. She promised me she was going home. What did happen? Elia asked, suddenly curious. She came with me all the way to White Harbor. The stubborn woman refused to leave, even when we got attacked by clansmen and when we almost drowned. Elia's eyebrow rose. She did not tell me the full story then. And at what point did you put a baby in her? Ned's heart rate plummeted. She's pregnant. Ned asked in a small voice he didn't recognize. Yes. Elia confirmed. It's why I dismissed her. By now she'd be about 7 months along. Ned got to his feet, his head spinning. I need to get to her. He stammered. She's about to have my child. He rushed to the door, before stopping. Your choice. He asked the princess. Will it be Mount Starpoint or Greywater Watch? The princess looked at Lord Reed, who shrugged. I would advise Starpoint. He said to her. Greywater Watch is no place to raise a child not of the Crannogs. The princess nodded before turning back to Lord Stark. Mount Starpoint it is then. Ned nodded and rushed out of the tent. First to find Bern and give him his instructions regarding the princess, and then on to find Ashura. He was going to have a child, Ned thought exuberantly, he was going to be a father. Chapter 52, Rickard v. Return of the King. Summary. Robert arrives in King's Landing. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. Robert entered King's Landing with all the pomp and circumstance of a returning conqueror, even though he had done absolutely nothing to actually take the city. Instead he'd sat on his ass at the Trident convincing Sir Barristan Selmy to serve in his Kingsguard. Pathetic fool. Sir Barristan deserved to die, and in their camp on the Trident Rickard had argued strenuously for the right to take his head. He had stood by and watched as Aes had burned innocent men alive, gods he had been there on the day he was burnt and his son was killed. Jon Arryn and Robert Baratheon had stood against him though, arguing that Sir Barristan was a good way to legitimize Robert's rule. Legitimize Robert's rule. If anyone wanted to argue about the legitimacy of Robert's rule they were more than welcome to come and tell Rickard. He would call his banners and show them how right of conquest was a way of legitimizing someone's rule. Wasn't that what Aegon had done 280 years ago with his dragons? If anyone was to push that argument then Rickard could simply point out that the Targaryens' rule wasn't legitimate in the first place by their own train of thought. These Southerners were just so stupid. And annoying. Rickard didn't even want to think about Tywin Lannister. He had been harassing him for days, sending pages after him wanting to know all manner of things. Where is Gregor Clegane? What happened to Amory Lorque? Where is Princess Elia? Why can't my troops come into the city? Why do your troops get to wander the city? Why am I in the offices of the Master of Coin? I deserve the Tower of the Hand. All Tywin Lannister had done this entire war was sit and brood in the west, until the end upon which point he had tried to sack a city, and failed. That was why Gregor Clegane was in the Black Cells and Amory Lorque was dead. That was why Elia Martell's fate was barred to Lannister spies. That was why Lannister troops weren't allowed to enter the city. That was why Tywin Lannister was sitting in the offices of the Master of Coin. That was why Tywin Lannister didn't deserve the Tower of the Hand. He had done nothing and expected everything. The man behaved as though this was some great chess game that he was playing with Rickard. Did he not understand that Rickard had no interest in playing with him? Maybe Rickard did have an interest in the Game of Thrones once upon a time, but then he lost a son and a daughter and got horribly scarred. Rickard figured the best way to win the game was to not play by their rules. He would do as his ancestors had done for the last 8,000 years and simply play by his own rules. Robert ascended up Egon's Hill to the Red Keep where Rickard Stark was waiting with Ned. Ned had been going out of his mind when he got back to the city yesterday. It turned out he'd managed to impregnate the woman who had followed him through the mountains. Rickard had convinced him to stay for Robert's arrival before he hopped on Burns' ship and took the fleet and the army south to finish the war and marry his betrothed. Behind Robert came his entourage. On his right sat Jon Arryn, Robert's foster father and the soon-to-be Hand of the King. On his left rode Ser Barristan, now the Lord Commander of Robert's Kingsguard. Behind them came the other principal commanders and advisors of the rebel forces. The Tully brothers, Lords Blackwood, Bracken, Mallister and Piper from the Riverlands, Lords Royce, Corbray, Waynwood and Redfort from the Vale. Then came the northern lords that Rickard had left in command of the northern infantry forces. Lords Dustin, Mormont, Tallheart, Sewin, Flint, Marndaley, Hornwood, Northstark, Skarstark and Hellstarks were the most prominent northern lords present. The number of northern lords absolutely swamped the numbers of river lords and vale lords in attendance. More than two-thirds of the column was made up of northern lords. Robert dismounted in front of Rickard and Rickard bowed his head in deference. Never would Rickard kneel before a man again, not after what the last one had done to him. Rickard couldn't trust those who thought everyone else had to bow before them. He had told Robert so as well, and thankfully Robert had agreed. Not that he'd had much choice in the matter. Robert. Rickard greeted, King's Landing is yours. Thank you Lord Stark. Robert said before glancing over his shoulder in the direction of the old gate. I couldn't help but notice the new decorations outside the old gate. I must say it is quite the intimidating sight. Good. Rickard replied. Perhaps it will stop their supporters from doing anything stupid. Robert smiled at him before bursting out laughing and turning to Ned. He enveloped him in a hug. Your family has been avenged, Ned. Robert cried, next we just have to find your sister and she will be queen. Then we'll be real brothers. Ned smiled tightly, clearly wound up over the news he had received yesterday. Ned managed to reply. Tywin Lannister stepped forward then, his gaudy golden armor flashing in the sun. My king. He said as he took the knee. I came to take the city for you, but when I arrived your loyal allies had already taken it. Robert nodded and Rickard frowned. Do us all a favor Lord Tywin and shut up. Your lies are convincing no one. Lord Tywin glared at him while Robert laughed. After a moment he turned away from Rickard and returned his gaze to Robert. If I can be of any assistance in any capacity just let me know your grace. I have already sent word to the Lannister fleet to make their way here to help you capture Dragonstone. Don't bother. Rickard said. The main northern fleet should be passing the Vale now. They'll be here within 2 weeks. Tywin's glare could have melted stone. Surely your fleet will need assistance though. Tywin said as he got to his feet. Rickard shook his head. No, I don't think so. My eastern fleet already broke the naval blockade of Storm's End. I'm sure between both my western, eastern and central fleets I should be able to take Dragonstone. Tywin gave up then and instead turned away from Rickard to speak with Jon Arryn. Robert, Ned and Rickard strode towards the throne room where Robert's coronation would be held. Inside it had all been set up, ready for Robert to ascend to his rule. The doors to the great hall opened and all the lords shuffled in. The only ones who remained behind were Ned, Rickard, Jon Arryn and Robert. As the last lords filed in, Rickard turned to Ned and grabbed him by the shoulder, pulling him away from the crowds. When we get in there let me explain what happened to Elia. Ned frowned at him. Why? He asked. You weren't there. Tywine has his suspicions. Ricard replied, and Ned's eyes widened. He nodded before going back to join Robert and Jon. Ricard entered the great hall with Ned and Jon and felt the weight of the hundreds of pairs of eyes on him. Strangely, it felt slightly similar to the last time he had been in this hall with one of his sons. His skin crawled at the memory of those hungry green flames. Jon Arryn took the seat at the base of the throne, indicating his status as Hand of the King. Ricard and Ned stood to the right of the throne. At the end of the hall the herald stepped forth and slammed the butt of his staff upon the stones. It echoes around the chamber, quieting the buzz of conversation. All kneel before King Robert Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. As Robert Baratheon strode into the room, all present fell to their knees with the exception of Ricard. He noticed a few strange glances sent his way, and received a rather amusing glare from Tywine Lannister. He winked at the Lion Lord, who clenched his jaw and shifted his gaze back to Robert, who was walking up the steps to the throne. He sat down upon it before calling for the court to rise. The assembled rose to their feet and Robert began to ascertain his rule. Lord Jon Arryn. He called, and Jon rose from his seat to stand before the king. Your Grace. Jon said as he bowed low. I am yours to serve. Rise, Lord Arryn. For your services to me throughout the rebellion, I would name you Hand of the King. If you have any boon you wish to ask of me, ask now. Thank you, Your Grace, but I have no boon as of this time. Jon Arryn got to his feet and returned to his seat. Lord Eddard Stark. Robert called, and Ned stepped in front of the throne. I am yours to command, Your Grace. Name any boon of me, Ned, and I will give it to you, even if it be half my kingdom. In the stands the present lords burst into chatter at the generosity of what Robert had just offered. It was a good show by Robert. He knew Ned would never ask for half a kingdom, and so had looked incredibly generous to his erstwhile allies while still not giving much away at all. Ned glanced at Ricard, and Ricard knew what he was going to ask for. Ricard shook his head at Ned, and Ned seemed torn for a moment, before acquiescing to Ricard's will. No, Your Grace. Ned said, I am content with what I have. Robert leaned forward. Are you sure, Ned? Ned nodded. If I can, Your Grace, may I gift my boon to my father? Of course. Robert replied, and Ned nodded before stepping back to Ricard's side. Ricard Stark. Robert called, and Ricard stepped forth. Your Grace, Ricard said, as he bowed his head in deference. His actions caused the throne room to burst into murmurs again. Robert looked out upon the whispering masses, before turning his gaze back to Ricard. Let it be known, that from this day forth Ricard Stark does not have to kneel before me or my descendants. This caused even more murmurings to occur. Ricard Stark, Robert continued, if you have any boon you would ask of me, ask me now. As you have no doubt also heard, your son has chosen to give his boon unto you. If you wish to use that boon also ask me now. Ricard nodded and stepped forward. There are a few things, Your Grace. Robert nodded, and Ricard turned to the back of the hall, where Stark soldiers stood guard. He nodded to them, and the doors opened to reveal 3 caskets held aloft by more Stark soldiers. The soldiers entered the throne room and set the caskets down before the throne. Ricard returned his gaze to Robert, who he noticed had a hungry and triumphant gleam in his eyes. A glance to Tywine confirmed that he was also satisfied with what Ricard had produced, though he caught the shadows of a smirk playing across his features. Your Grace, for my first boon, I ask for justice. Robert frowned at Ricard. Justice? He asked. Yes. Ricard replied. Justice. Justice for Elia Martell and her children who were killed by a Lannister bannerman, Amory Lorque, and assisted by another Lannister bannerman, Gregor Clegane. What do you want me to do? Robert asked. Amory Lorque is already dead, slain after he attacked my son while being caught in the act of raping Elia Martell. I ask that you take the head of Gregor Clegane and whoever gave him his orders. If I may, Your Grace, Tywine interrupted, can we see the contents of the caskets? Robert nodded. At once. Ricard nodded to his men, who tore off the lids of the caskets. Inside the first casket, was a small collection of bones, clearly belonging to a babe, with a smashed skull. Inside the second was the skeleton of another infant, though the ribcage of this one had been shattered. The final casket revealed a broken and shattered skeleton that hardly resembled a human at all. I had the bodies prepared by the Silent Sisters before your arrival. Ricard explained. Ned and I are planning to travel to Dawn on the morrow to deliver them. How do we know these skeletons belong to who you say they do, Lord Stark? Tywine asked, and Ricard glared at him. Are you calling me a liar? He asked in a low voice. Not at all. Tywine replied with a smug grin. I'm just saying you were misinformed about whose bodies these were. What are you saying, Lannister? Robert interrupted, and Tywine smirked at Ricard triumphantly. I am saying that these are not the skeletons of Elia Martell and her children. Tywine's declaration was met with uproar, especially from the Lords of the North. Great Jon Umber had almost drawn his sword from his scabbard and was already advancing down the hall towards him. Enough! Ricard roared, and the Northern Lords fell silent, though they still simmered in fury. Explain yourself, Lord Tywine. Tywine nodded and turned to the king. When I arrived at the city, I had sent men to ensure the princess was kept safe. Ricard scoffed and drew ice. If you're going to tell a tale, Lord Tywine, tell it true or don't tell it at all. Quiet! Robert roared at Ricard, and Ricard turned his glare upon the king, who shrunk back in his throne, before regathering his courage. Not another word until he has finished what he has to say. Ricard smiled at the king tightly before nodding his head and turning back to Tywine. Tywine smiled at him, before resuming his tale. As I was saying, after the city had been taken, the knowledge of everything was barred to me. Ricard refused to meet with me, and kept diverting my pages to Lord Bolton. So I sent my men into the city to find people who had known what had happened. Is this true, Lord Stark? Robert asked. Did you refuse to meet with Lord Lannister? Of course I refused to meet with Lord Lannister. Ricard scoffed. Why? Robert asked. He was annoying me. Ricard snapped. He had done absolutely nothing the entire war and then showed up at the end to take a city that was by all rights ours to take. Robert nodded thoughtfully before gesturing for Lord Lannister to go on. My men found a woman in the fish markets who swore she had seen the princess on the day of the capture of King's Landing fleeing towards the docks. So what? Grumbled Robert. The commoners tell many tales. Doesn't mean they are all true. And I would be inclined to agree with you, Your Grace, but for two reasons. Tywine continued. The first, the woman we found worked within the Red Keep, in the kitchens, and had seen the princess on multiple occasions. Secondly, Aerys had been keeping a ship in the docks down there in case he needed to leave the city in a rush. It was called the Sea Dragon. A few minutes after this woman said she saw her, that ship was reported to have left the docks. Robert rose to his feet. Well then, whose bodies are these? I don't know. Tywine replied, but I do have a suggestion of what happened. Go on. Robert said. I believe these are decoys placed there by sympathizers to the crown. Meanwhile Elia fled with her children to the docks and escaped to Dragonstone. Robert turned to the crowds. Lord Varys. He called, and the spymaster of Aerys stepped forth. You asked for an opportunity to prove yourself to my rule. Here it is, go and find out what happened to the ship. Lord Varys nodded and went to rush away when he was stopped by another voice. There is no need. Byrne Salt Stark said as he emerged from the masses of men. I sunk the Sea Dragon as it left the city yesterday. The court sat in silence while they digested this news, and then Robert said what everyone was thinking. Well then, regardless, the whore and her dragon spawn are dead. Robert. Ned said as he stepped forth, horror in his features. They were innocent. It was two infants and a woman. They were Rhaegar's spawn. Robert spat. They deserved to die for having his blood running through their veins. And what of Elia Martell? Ned cried, she had none of Rhaegar's blood. She lay with him. Robert roared. They were innocent. Ned insisted. Oh, by the gods, Ned, by your own man's admission he may have killed them. How's that for justice? Ricard stiffened, angry at having his words thrown back in his face. Justice has already been had for House Targaryen. Aerys was slain by a white sword, and Rhaegar will forever watch over the city of his ancestors. Justice has not been had for the murderers of Elia Martell and her children. Well then, kill Byrne Saltstock. Robert roared. The hall, if it had been quiet before, dropped to a silence so complete you could have heard the sound of a pin dropping. Wordlessly Ned stormed for the door, most of the northern lords following him. Where are you going? Robert roared. I haven't given you my permission to leave. Ned whirled around, anger lining his long features. With respect, your grace, I don't need your permission to leave. Don't forget, Robert, that it was northern soldiers who put you on this throne. It is northern soldiers that can take you off of it, just as quickly as they put you on it. Robert's face turned scarlet and he made to reply, but Ned had already left. Most of the other northern lords had gone with him, leaving just Rickard, Lord Bolton and Roderick Walton behind. You should teach your son to respect his king, Tywine said, but was silenced when Robert turned his baleful gaze upon Tywine. Enough. He snarled. Rickard stepped forth once more. I believe I still have a boon to ask of you, your grace. Robert glared at him. What do you want? He snapped. Rickard smiled at the angry king. I would ask that you release my daughter from her betrothal to you. No. Robert roared and he got up from his throne. I fought a war for her hand and I will not lose it now. She loves me and I love her. Rickard briefly pondered telling Robert the truth, but then decided not to. Let him live in his fantasy. Maybe his love for Lyanna will poison his love for whoever eventually becomes his wife. From the way that Tywine was trying to suppress his grin, Rickard guessed it would soon end up being Cersei Lannister. Very well. Rickard said, but I believe that still leaves me with a boon to ask of you. I will be back for it one day. Then without another word he turned and followed his son. He would finish this war, find his daughter and see Ned married to the woman he loved. Chapter 53, Eddard 15, Treason. Summary. Ned's upset. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Chapter text. Ned left the throne room literally shaking in anger. What was wrong with Robert? Was he not aware of whose head he had just asked for? The man had lost 2 brothers saving Robert's ancestral keep, Storm's End, and instead of rewarding him like he deserved, he had thrown his service back in his face and called for the man's head. Gods, he was glad his father had told Robert now. If Ned had have done it the way he wanted to, Robert would have told him to bring him the heads of the innocents he had rescued. At first Ned had thought he was protecting the princess and her children from Tywine Lannister, but now he realized that she would be safer with everyone believing she was dead. He had hoped that he would be able to tell Robert what he had done, but now he knew he could not. Gods, Ned realized with a start, what he had done was treason. Ned shook his head. He had done the right thing. Technically he had already committed treason against one king, what was another act of treason against the other? It must have been something about the Iron Throne, something that drove men mad with the power it granted them. The Robert that had sat upon that throne was not the Robert that had been raised alongside Eddard Stark in the halls of the Eyrie. That Robert would never have stood by as a man attempted to kill 2 children and a woman. That man would have been ashamed of himself. Elia Martell and her children would be safe in Starpoint though. It was an impregnable fortress within the northern mountains, guarded and manned by the deadliest warriors in the world, men and women that spent every day of every year practicing with every weapon under the sun. Those warriors were the old gods' chosen harbingers. None would be able to stand against them, or take their charges from them. Tywine Lannister's gold couldn't reach them there, nor could Robert's armies. Ned just hoped they would get there safely. Byrne had left it to Davos and the Weirwood warriors that had rescued them to get her and her children to Mount Starpoint, and they were as capable hands as any. Lord Seaworth had already rescued the princess from the jaws of the Red Keep when the world thought she was dead. He figured he would be more than able to get her to the north, especially with the protection of the Weirwood warriors. Ned left the Red Keep with his lords following behind him. He made his way to the stable and readied his horse. Together, he and his lords rode down to the docks, where some of the northern army was boarding the eastern fleet. The North's cavalry, the 40,000 men who took King's Landing, would ride down the King's Road to Storm's End, while Ned would take the infantry, another 40,000 men, down the coast and disembark at Storm's End. There, they would finally break the land siege of Storm's End, not that it was doing much nowadays, before Ned would send the army home. From there Ned and his father and some trusted companions would travel to Sunspear to return the bodies of Elia Martell and her children. Then it would be on to Ashura, on to marry her and be there when she gave birth to his child. Then from there Ned would set out with his father to find his sister, whichever hole Roriger had hidden her in. His father had somehow found out where she was hidden, though for now he had refused to tell Ned. He had just said it was in Dorne. Ned's thoughts of Dorne and Ashura led him to think of another Dane, one he hadn't thought of in a while, and one he hadn't seen. He had knelt before the heart tree with Ashura. Ned wondered if Arthur Dane knew where his sister was, if he was guarding her even now. Ned dreaded crossing blades with Arthur. It was one of the last outcomes Ned wanted to face, and not simply because Arthur was a knight of renown and skill. Ned. A voice said, and Ned stirred to see Bern approaching him. Bern. Ned greeted sadly. I am sorry for what Robert said. Bern shrugged. Don't matter to me. One day, when the White Wolf comes, all insults will be repaid. Ned replied sadly. They will. Ned just hoped the White Wolf did not come in his lifetime. He had no intention of going to war with the South again. Ned just wanted to go home with Ashura and his child and live a happy, contented and peaceful life. The ships will be loaded within the hour. Bern said as they walked down the dock together. We can leave by this evening's tide. Good. Ned replied, but he felt no joy. How fare the men? Morale is high. Bern replied. We smashed them at Stony September, we smashed them at the Trident, I smashed them at Storm's End, you smashed them at God's Eye, we took King's Landing almost bloodlessly, and now we march to destroy the last Targaryen loyalists' host. Good. Ned replied, though I doubt Mace Tyrell will put up much of a fight, especially with Lord Tarly in our possession. Lord Tarly was currently being held in Raventree Hall, under the guard of Lord Blackwood's men. It was well known that Tarly was Mace Tyrell's most competent battle commander, and had delivered to Robert his only defeat. In truth, Ned fully expected Lord Tyrell to bend the knee the second Ned and his armies arrived. Bern nodded and rushed away to oversee the loading of some crates onto one of his ships. Ned found himself alone at the end of the docks, staring out over the waters of the Blackwater Rush and towards Blackwater Bay. He felt a hand alight on his shoulder and turned to see the horrible visage of his father. He embraced the man in a hug, and buried his face in his shoulder. Ned hadn't felt like this in years, and he hadn't cried into his father's shoulder like this since before he was 8. It's all right. His father murmured as he patted his back consolingly. It's all right. We got the better of them in the end. Ned sobbed even harder, reminded of the crime he had now committed. He had thought Robert would stand by in protecting the innocents of this conflict, but instead he had rejoiced in the slaughter of children. Where did we go wrong? Ned asked. Since when did we condone the murder of innocents? We don't. Ricard replied. Our king did. Ned stated. He's no king of mine. Ricard shot back. Don't say that, father. Ned pleaded. Why not? It's treason. So was rebelling against Aes. Ricard snarled. I have no plans to rebel against Robert. And neither do I. Ricard replied. But I will not recognize Robert as my king. I did not bend the knee. No, you did not. Ned replied, but I did. I know. Ricard said with what Ned thought was a twinge of sadness. But we have more important things to do now. The siege of Storm's End must be lifted, and then on to Sunspear. Then we will see Ashura. Yes, Ricard replied, then on to see Ashura and marry her. And then we find Lyak. Ricard replied wistfully. And then on to find Lyak. Have you found her yet? Ned asked his father. Yes. His father replied, my spy sent word yesterday. Apparently she's holed up in a place called the Tower of Joy with the remaining Kingsguard. Where's that? Ned asked. In Dorne. His father replied, about 2 weeks north of Starfall. Good. Ned replied, relief washing over him. It was good to receive some good news after so much heartache. Soon she'll be home. Ricard replied, perhaps a touch sadly. Soon she'll be home. With that Ned's father turned and walked away, off to see someone else. Ned turned to the ship he would be sailing on, Burns the Salty Wolf, when he was stopped by a hand on his arm. He turned to behold John Arryn standing before him. Ned squinted at him suspiciously. Had Robert sent him? What do you want, John? Ned asked. Has Robert sent you to drag me back to him? John Arryn smiled at him sadly. No, he replied, he's gone off to find himself a drink, I believe. He wasn't happy after your father tried to break the betrothal, and then to add salt to his wound when he offered Tywin a boon. He asked if he would marry his daughter Cersei Lannister. Good. Ned snarled. He deserved a frigid bitch like her. Lyanna would hate Robert. Ned, John pleaded. Don't Ned me. Ned snapped. I'm not the one who not only refused to bring murderers to justice, but instead accused the man who saved his ancestral home of their crimes. That's not fair, Ned. Not fair. Ned exclaimed. Byrne Salt Stark lost both of his brother when he broke the naval blockade of Storm's End, and how does Robert repay him? By telling my father if he wants justice for Elia Martell he has to kill him. That is what is not fair. Ned, the babes would have been a threat to his reign. Ned stared at John, slightly taken aback. Are you defending what Tywin Lannister did? He asked incredulously. No. John exclaimed with a twist of his features, this war has been hard on all of us, Ned. Really? Ned asked. I wouldn't have noticed. I only lost a brother, had my sister kidnapped, and my father almost burned alive. Throughout all of that I didn't realize this war wasn't sunshine and happiness for all of us. Ned, John pleaded one last time. Don't let your departure with Robert be on bad terms. He's the one who left it on bad terms. Ned insisted. You threatened to throw him from his throne. John replied. He threatened one of my most loyal bannermen. He did. John conceded. He did the wrong thing. I will not see Robert until he has issued a formal apology to Byrne at the very least. John sighed, before nodding his head. I will see what I can do. Good. Ned replied before going to walk off. Ned. John called. Ned turned around and looked back at his foster father. You've done well. John affirmed. You made the right decision in fighting for the innocents. Many a weaker man would have fled before Robert's wrath. Ned nodded, slightly warmed at his foster father's words, before he allowed his fury to fill him again. Many a weaker man would have fled from Aes Madness too. John winced at Ned's insinuation before Ned turned and stormed off to meet with Byrne and prepare to leave on the evening tide. Chapter 54, Tywin 4, The Burnt Wolf. Summary. Rickard and Tywin have a chat. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Tywin Lannister wandered into the offices of the Master of Coin to be greeted by the sight of Rickard Stark rifling through the letters on his desk. The Burnt Lord looked up upon his arrival before smiling at him in that grotesque way that twisted his burns even further, a sight that would give nightmares to even the most battle-hardened of men. Tywin was sure that there would be some Targaryen soldiers somewhere that would see this face when they closed their eyes. Tywin Lannister wasn't sure how to feel about Rickard Stark. He had thought he had known all he needed to of the North when this war began, but then he had been surprised beyond his wildest dreams. It seemed the North was not the underdeveloped, sparsely populated backwater the Starks had led the realm to believe. The Starks had marched south with an army as large as that of the Reach, backed by a navy that could have rivaled even the Royal Navy if Rickard Stark was to be believed. Tywin hadn't believed what his scouts had told him of the northern host until it had actually arrived, some 80,000 men, 40,000 of which rode horses. It seemed Tywin and the rest of the realm had gravely underestimated the Starks, but it was not a mistake Tywin planned on making again. What are you doing? Tywin asked as he stepped into the room, his hand on the sword that hung at his side. Rickard continued to smile that horrible smile at him before sitting down in the chair behind Tywin's desk. Please. He said, take a seat. Tywin stiffened. This was an insult of the highest order to be treated as a guest within his own offices. I think I will stand. Tywin replied. Rickard just smirked at him, before shrugging. So be it. What do you want? Tywin asked the Burnt Lord again. Just to talk. Ricard replied. I didn't realize that my refusal to speak with you had caused you so much offense, so here I am to rectify it. Tywine nodded and took a seat across from Ricard. So what did you want to talk about? Ricard asked as he continued to rifle through Tywine's letters. Can you stop that? Tywine snapped at Ricard. Ricard stopped his rifling and lifted his gaze to meet with Tywine's. Stop what? The Burnt Lord asked in a soft voice. Stop rifling through your letters. Yes. Tywine replied. That is private communications between me and my men. What did you want to talk about, Lord Lannister? Why are you lying about Elia Martell? Tywine asked. Why are you lying about Elia Martell? Ricard shot back. My men didn't kill her and her children. Tywine said as he smirked at Ricard. Didn't you hear the king? Byrne Salt Stark was responsible. Tywine saw a crack appear in the smug facade of the Burnt Lord, and felt a rush of pride. Byrne Salt Stark was a fool. Ricard replied. But you aren't, are you, Lord Lannister? What do you mean? You must be feeling quite proud of yourself at the moment, mustn't you? Soon you'll have a daughter for a queen. Is that what you killed Elia for? Tywine snorted. Haven't you heard, Lord Stark? Byrne Salt Stark killed Elia Martell. Ricard just rolled his eyes. Okay, Tywine. He replied, whatever you say. Tywine Lannister was sick of the disrespect of this man. To not even refer to him by his first name was an insult of the highest level, an insult that if word got out of it, his legacy would be threatened. Tywine got to his feet and lorded over Ricard Stark. Listen here, Burnt Wolf. Tywine spat. Just because you killed Rhaegar it does not make you one of the kings of Winter come again. In case you don't remember, the last time you were in this city you were running like the pup you are, with your tail tucked in between your legs while your abomination of a son. Tywine got no further because he had been thrown backwards across the room. His head cracked against the stone wall and his vision blurred. His body began to slump to the floor, not responding to his sluggish thoughts, when he was caught by his neck and slammed against the wall once again. He felt something crack against his cheeks in rapid succession and then a hot breath on his ear. Now you listen here, O great Lord of Lannister. Do you know what they say of me in the streets? Do you know what they whisper of me in the darkness? They say I am a man who defied death's very grasp. They call me the Burnt Lord and I wear that title as a badge of honor. From dawn to the wall they whisper my name in fear. The only people who whisper your name in fear are the ghosts of Castle Maria. This is my first and last warning for you, Lord Tywine. Disrespect me, anger me, provoke me in the slightest ever again and I will make Rhaegar's death look merciful compared as to what I will do to you. Am I clear? Tywine's mouth refused to move and he felt the crack of Ricard's gauntlet across his cheek. Am I clear? Ricard roared in his face. Yes, Tywine managed to slur out. Good. Ricard replied and he stepped away from Tywine, letting his throat go. Tywine collapsed to the floor, unable to hold his own weight up. He sucked in great lungfuls of air and his vision cleared. He looked up to see Ricard Stark glaring down at him, a sneer playing across his features. For the first time since meeting Ricard Stark, Tywine understood why his soldiers had heard whisperers of the Lord that had torn the realm apart in his quest for vengeance. At the moment, from where Tywine lay, Ricard Stark looked all the part of the Burnt Lord that the commoners whispered of in fear. His grey eyes burned right through Tywine, and the horrible scars on his face caught the light and twisted him into the grotesque monster that had turned Rhaegar Targaryen into a tree and mutilated Jon Connington. This was the man that was rumored by the Riverlords to have taken Riverrun in a midnight storm and swayed the entirety of the Riverlords to his cause. The Burnt Lord stared at him for a while before wandering over to the wine that sat on the side table and poured himself a cup. He took a long draught before placing the wine goblet down again. He turned back around and knelt beside Tywine, who was still lying on the floor. I come from a line of kings 8,000 years old. Aerys Targaryen thought because his ancestors had dragons he could do what he wanted with me. I proved him wrong. You think that because you have a literal mountain of gold you can do what you want to. I can prove you wrong as well if you would like. The Starks endure, Lord Tywine, and we will endure for another 8,000 years of the old gods will it. The Burnt Lord breathed deeply before getting back to his feet. Tywine crawled to his feet and stood up on shaking feet. You may be from a line of kings, but when Cersei marries Robert, your grandchildren will bow to mine. The burnt lord smiled coldly before striding to the door. Watch me prove you wrong, Lord Tywine. With that the burnt lord stormed out of the room, leaving the lingering smell of blood and charred flesh in his wake. Tywine sat down in his chair behind his desk before pulling out a piece of parchment and a quill. Tywine Lannister had shown House Rayne who was the undisputed lord, and he would show Rickard Stark as well. All he needed was time. Notes. Hey guys. I've got a Tumblr now if any of you want to talk to me in private about the fic or anything else. My username is King of Winter 11. Thanks. King of Winter. Chapter 55, Rollo I, Fleeing Dragonstone. Summary. Rollo makes plans. Chapter text. Outside of Dragonstone's walls the Targaryen fleet was preparing for war. Word had been received from loyalists within the Vale that a vast fleet of ships flying the standards of the running direwolf was making their way down the coast, in preparation for an attack upon Dragonstone. Even more ships had been spotted within Blackwater Bay, and loyalists within the Stormlands had sent word of yet another fleet of northern ships patrolling Shipbreaker Bay. The last word that had been received from King's Landing was that two armies were approaching, one from the west and one from the north. The northern one had clearly belonged to the rebels, but Rollo wasn't sure if the western one belonged to Tywine Lannister or Randyll Tarly. The lack of news from King's Landing since the last Raven seemed to suggest that the city had fallen, though to who was still unknown. There was still so much that Rollo and her supporters on Dragonstone did not know. She looked down and stroked the growing curve of her stomach. It had been Aerys' last gift to her on the night before she had left King's Landing for Dragonstone. It had left her with so many bruises and scratches that she had had to leave with a hood covering her head. Hopefully this child would grow strong to reclaim the lands of its ancestors. One day it would stand by Viserys' side as he swept those who had wronged her family away in a storm of fire and blood. Rollo sighed. Aerys and his madness had doomed her and her children to a life of exile, living in strange foreign lands, never knowing the lands of their birth. Rollo wondered if it was worth treating with the man they called the Burnt Lord, but then she had heard of the fate of Jon Connington and realized that the Burnt Lord had no interest in taking prisoners. As she sat down at the table where she and Viserys were being served food, the door opened and the old maester that served hurried into the room, a scroll clutched in his hands. He hurried over to where Rollo was sitting and offered her the scroll. She plucked it from his grasp and rolled it open. To the remnants of House Targaryen. Rhaegar Targaryen is dead, slain by Rickard Stark before the gates of King's Landing. Aerys Targaryen is dead, slain by Jaime Lannister as he fled the throne room. Aegon Targaryen is dead, slain by his enemies. Rhaenys Targaryen is dead, slain by her enemies. Elia Martell is dead, slain by her enemies. Jon Connington and his host were defeated at Stony September. Paxter Redwine's fleet was torn asunder at Storm's End. Randyll Tarly and his host were destroyed at the God's Eye. Rhaegar Targaryen and his host were decimated at the Trident. King's Landing fell to Rickard and Eddard Stark leading 40,000 northern soldiers. Your only victory was at Ashford, where Robert Baratheon was alone and friendless. Surrender, for your hopes of victory are naught. Rollo looked up at the maester. Where did this come from? She asked. King's Landing, my queen. Rollo nodded. She wondered who had sent it. She turned to the admiral of the Targaryen fleet, Lucerys Velaryon, who had fled from King's Landing with her. How goes the preparation of the fleet? She asked. It is ready, your grace. We have another fleet ready for you to flee in as well. Good. Rollo said as she turned to Viserys. Come here, Viserys. Viserys got up from his table and ran around the table to stand in front of his mother. Rollo stood up and pulled her crown from her head. As the only surviving male scion of House Targaryen, I hereby pronounce you Viserys of the House Targaryen, the third of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. With that Rollo placed her own crown upon his head, before lowering herself to one knee before him. Around her, all the other occupants of the room followed her example. She rose after a moment, and turned to the maester. Send ravens to all the great houses to support the ascension of Viserys to his throne. My queen, forgive my impertinence, but all support for your house has dried up within Westeros. The last army you have left sits outside of Storm's End, and rumor has it that Lord Stark and his son are on their way there now. I know. Rollo replied before turning to the Castle Castellan, Sir Willem d'Ari. Pack the household up and into what boats we have available. We flee at first light. The aged knight nodded before turning and rushing away to do as she bid. She turned her gaze on the Maester. Go and send those ravens at once. The Maester nodded and went to do as he had been told. Lucerys rushed forward and helped her into a seat. Rollo, he murmured, you cannot travel in your condition. It would do you and the baby harm. I know. Rollo sighed. But what other choice do I have? She asked. Surrender and beg for mercy. Lucerys suggested gently. Mercy? Rollo asked incredulously. Not only did they kill Rhaegar, they also killed his children, 2 infants. The only mercy I will receive from any of them will be a quick death for me and my children. No. I will not have that. We will flee. Where will you go though? We have holdings in Braavos. Rollo declared, and Lucerys shook his head. No. Braavos is all but owned by the Company of the Rose. You would find no safe harbor there. They are some of the North's closest allies. Where then? Rollo asked. Volantis perhaps. Lucerys suggested. Relations between the North and Volantis are few and far in between. Westerosi have never dealt in slaves. Behind the Black Walls you will be safe from any Assizanes the usurper or the Starks will send after you. Volantis then. Rollo declared. Set a course for it tonight, ready for us when we leave in the morn. Lucerys nodded and rushed away, leaving Rollo alone with her thoughts. She prayed to whatever gods were listening to allow her and her children to escape to Volantis. She had no clue if it would be far enough to escape the Burnt Lord's reach, but surely even the North would balk at provoking the first daughter of Valyria, the most powerful of all the free cities. The North had proven that they were not what they had led them all to believe, but were they powerful enough to extend their reach within the Black Walls, walls that only the blood of old Valyria could pass through? Her head told her no, but then her head had also told her that Rhaegar would win the Battle of the Trident. He had lost though, and then killed by Rickard Stark himself before his armies swarmed the gates of King's Landing. She remembered back to the last day she had seen him, his cold grey eyes glaring maliciously at all who had stood by and watched as her husband had tried to burn him alive. She remembered the way they had slid over all of those present, committing them all to memory. Then his gaze had returned to her husband and had hardened even further. She still remembered the way those grey eyes stared even as the flames licked at his gilded armor, even as his screams split the air, even as the skin around his face began to melt from the heat. Then it had all gone wrong and Brandon Stark had become a monster of legend, half man, half wolf, and he had torn the city apart in his attempts to free his father. He had succeeded to her house's detriment, and Rickard Stark had done what none other had managed over 300 years. He had achieved what the Dornish, the Black Fyres and the Ninepenny Kings had failed at, throwing the Targaryens from the Iron Throne. Robert Baratheon may have been the one they crowned king, but history would remember this conflict as Rickard's rebellion, not Robert's rebellion. It was Rickard Stark who had been wronged, and it was Rickard Stark who had torn them all down and killed her son, the one they called the Last Dragon. The Last Dragon was dead, and with his death had come the collapse of all support for House Targaryen. None wanted to support a child king, especially one with a father like Aerys. With Rhaegar they at least had assurance that he was not like his father, but Viserys had been given no chance to prove otherwise to anyone. Rollo sighed. It seemed that the dragons had finally fallen from the lofty heights that Aegon the Conqueror had brought them. One day her children would return House Targaryen to its place among the stars, for now though she would flee to the east to give Viserys time to grow into the king he had to be to stop the Starks and reclaim the Iron Throne. Chapter 56, Mace bending the knee. Summary. Mace bends the knee. Leave a comment and tell me what you think. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Mace Tyrell watched as the battle hardened. Grizzled soldiers flying the banners of House Stark arrayed their forces into battle lines behind the siege lines that surrounded Storm's End. They had landed further up the coast under the cover of last night's darkness, and then undertaken a midnight march to catch Mace's troops unawares. As the sun peeked over the horizon, it had revealed the vast host that was prepared to fight them. The siege of Storm's End had been a disaster from Mace's perspective, accomplishing exactly nothing. It should have been an easy conquest, a castle low on supplies and lightly garrisoned by green boys and old men. The green boys and old men had proven more stubborn than Mace and his commanders had envisioned, leading the common soldiers to dub the castle's commander, the young Stannis Baratheon, stubborn starving Stannis. Then the Northern fleet had arrived with the monster that had single-handedly wiped out a quarter of Paxter Redwyne's fleet. Mace had seen it himself from afar when he had been observing the fleet from the coast one day. It had launched itself from beneath the surface in an explosion of seawater before smashing into a ship that had broken up like matchwood beneath its great weight. The few maesters that had accompanied them suggested it to be some strange monster that lived in the cold waters of the north called a whale. They suggested that it may have been controlled by a warg somewhere. Between the monster and the swift northern fleet that attacked only under cover of darkness, the Redwyne fleet had broken, fleeing down the coast, back to the much safer waters of the Arbor. Now the garrison that had been starving and low on men and supplies was refreshed and relived by the same northern ship that had slipped through their lines every night for 2 weeks. It had taken them 2 weeks to figure out what they were doing, and by the time they did, the garrison had been relieved and the Redwyne fleet was either sitting at the bottom of Shipbreaker Bay or fleeing down the coast. Then a further blow had come to Mace's siege efforts when word had come from the capital demanding reinforcements from Mace's host. Randil Tarly had left with almost half of his host, some 20,000 men. Mace had heard later that they had all but disappeared somewhere around God's Eye. If he would ever see any of them again, it seemed no one would know. With half the host he had once had and a castle that was well stocked, well manned and being resupplied almost daily, Mace wondered what he was doing here. It had gone so bad that his mother had decided to come and fix up the mess that had been made of this siege, arriving in a gilded carriage and flanked by almost 200 guards. She had entered the command tent and immediately begun barking commands at him in front of his bannermen, much to his own embarrassment. She stood next to him now, clutching his arm as she watched the Stark line settle down in preparation for battle. Her lips were pursed and she watched the line with a growing skull. "He's managed to outsmart us too," she muttered. "It wouldn't be insulting if it was just you here, but thanks to my own sense of self-preservation I'm here too. If I die because of your incompetence, you great fool, I'll chase you through the 7 hells. Are you listening to me, Mace?" Mace nodded wordlessly, unable to tear his eyes away from the 3 men who rode along the front lines of the Stark column. The first was the most normal of the 3 men, riding a chestnut stallion and wearing plain grey plate armor. The only splash of color on the man was the beautiful white scabbard that hung at his side. Thrown over his shoulders was a fur cloak, and grasped firmly in his hands was the banner of the Starks, fluttering in the wind that blew. The next man was also dressed in plain grey plate, but this was where the similarities ended. He rode a grey stallion and on his back was a giant great sword that could have only been ice, the ancestral Valyrian steel blade of House Stark. He wore a dappled grey cloak that fluttered in the wind, but the most horrifying aspect of the man was the horrible scars that covered his face. This could only be Rickard Stark, infamously known throughout the 7 Kingdom as the Burnt Lord. Next to him rode the strangest and the weirdest of the 3. He rode a great white hart, and running by his side was 2 wolves, while on his shoulder sat a giant golden eagle. His armor seemed to be made of bronze and steel, while he wore a helm of white weirwood that concealed his features. Mace swallowed thickly. He had heard the rumors of what Brandon Stark had done at King's Landing. He wondered if this was one of the monsters that Brandon Stark was said to have been. "Well, what are you waiting for?" his mother snapped at him. "Send an envoy with peace terms before they decide to attack." Mace nodded before gesturing for his herald to go. He didn't tear his eyes away from the opposing host once. The herald nodded and spurred his horse forward, into the stretch of ground that lay between the opposing hosts. Almost immediately the stance of the Stark host changed. Where once they had been relaxed, their men snapped into formation. He saw their archers raised their bows, while their infantrymen lowered their spears and crouched behind their shields. The cavalry they had with them lowered the lances and crouched into the saddles, while from out of the ranks of men hundreds of animals melted forwards. Wolves, bears, lions, and hulking beasts that were almost twice the size of normal wolves, but still smaller than the dire wolves that ran upon the Stark's banners. The eagle that sat upon the shoulder of the man who rode the White Hart took flight and drifted across the fields towards the herald, who continued to make his way forward. Rickard Stark spurred his own horse forward, and was flanked by his companions as they rode out to meet the herald. They met just beyond halfway from Mace's lines, and words were exchanged that Mace could not hear. For a moment nothing happened, and then the herald turned around and spurred his horse back to their lines. Rickard Stark and his companions stayed behind, however, watching Mace's herald as he rushed back to them. "He says he'll talk terms now. Meet him where he sits now," the herald said as he pulled his horse to a stop. Mace nodded before turning to and mounting his horse. His mother turned to her guards.